Howdy stranger. Tonight we're gonna dive deep into one of the most romanticized chapters of American history, the Gold Rush. You know, that glittering fantasy where anyone with a pan and determination could strike it rich. Well, you've probably seen those sepia photographs of proud miners holding gold nuggets. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You probably wouldn't have survived it. In fact, if time travel were real, the Gold Rush would be the last era I'd recommend visiting. Unless dying of dysentery while covered in mud sounds like your idea of a good time. Before we get started, take a second to like this video and subscribe. But only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. I'm curious, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments below. Alright, now relax. Turn off those notifications, slow down those racing thoughts, and imagine that the only light around comes from a campfire. That's where today's story begins. As you listen with your eyes closed and let the Old West keep you company until sleep arrives. The year is 1848, and you've just heard the news that's setting the nation on fire. Gold found in California. You're not doing particularly well in your current situation. Maybe you're a struggling farmer in the Midwest, a factory worker in the crowded East, or perhaps you're an immigrant who arrived with dreams that haven't quite panned out yet. Whatever your circumstances, gold fever hits you hard and fast. It's like a virus of hope, spreading through newspaper headlines and whispered conversations. Did you hear about that fella who found a nugget the size of an egg? Made more in a day than I'll see in 5 years. So you decide to go. What choice do you have, really? The promise of instant wealth is too tempting, and everyone around you seems to be catching the same fever. You scrape together your life savings, perhaps $100 if you're lucky, and bid farewell to your family. I'll be back in a year, you promise, with enough gold to build us a proper house and never worry about money again. Your spouse looks skeptical but supportive. The children don't quite understand why daddy or mummy, though female miners were rare, is leaving for so long. You don't realize it yet, but many who made this promise never returned. Their bodies buried in unmarked graves along the trail or in forgotten mining camps. The initial excitement carries you through the first stages of preparation. You purchase the essential equipment that merchants are all too happy to sell at inflated prices: picks, shovels, pans, boots, and perhaps a guidebook written by someone who's never actually mined gold. It's like buying exercise equipment on New Year's Day, full of optimism that ignores the harsh reality ahead. The journey begins, and reality starts chipping away at your dreams almost immediately. If you're heading to California in 1849, you have 3 terrible options: an 18,000-mile sea journey around the tip of South America, a shorter but disease-ridden trek across the Panama Isthmus, or the overland trail across the American frontier. None of these are remotely pleasant. Let's say you choose the overland route, the most common choice for Americans without much money. Your first major purchase, a wagon and oxen that cost nearly everything you have. And here's the first cruel joke of the Gold Rush. That wagon becomes both your greatest asset and your greatest burden. It's too heavy, constantly breaking down, and the oxen, well, they're stubborn, slow, and prone to dying at the most inconvenient times. Unlike the Oregon Trail video game, where you can simply press a button to continue after your oxen die, the real-life consequence was potentially fatal. The initial miles feel like an adventure. There's camaraderie among the wagon trains, singing around campfires, and the wide-open frontier ahead. This honeymoon phase lasts approximately 2 weeks. Then the blisters form. Your back aches constantly from walking, because riding in the wagon on those roads would rattle your teeth out. Your hands, soft from your previous life, develop painful calluses that crack and bleed. And you haven't even started mining yet. This is just the commute. Disease becomes your constant companion. Cholera sweeps through wagon trains with terrifying efficiency. It's a particularly nasty illness that can take you from healthy to dead in 24 hours. Your body essentially dehydrating itself to death. Dysentery, the infamous killer of the trail, ensures that any privacy or dignity you once had is quickly abandoned. Imagine the worst food poisoning you've ever had, then multiply it by 10, with no bathroom, no medicine, and no end in sight. Historians estimate that about 1 in 10 gold seekers died before even reaching the goldfields. That would be like losing 30 kids from your elementary school simply trying to get to the playground. Food supplies dwindle faster than expected. Those who packed luxury items like coffee and sugar find themselves trading them for essentials like flour and salt. The hunting, which seemed so promising in the beginning, becomes scarce as thousands of wagons travel the same route. You find yourself eating things you never imagined. Prairie dogs, crows, even boiled shoe leather in desperate times. And all of this happens before you've seen a single speck of gold. The gold fever that infected you back home sustains you through these hardships. It will all be worth it, you tell yourself each night as you collapse in exhaustion. Just one good strike, that's all I need. What you don't know, what almost no one knew in those early days is that finding gold isn't just about luck. It's about geological knowledge, technical skill, and arriving early enough to claim the easy pickings. By the time most 49ers arrived in California, the surface gold that could be gathered with simple pans had largely been claimed. The easy money was already gone, but no one had bothered to send that news back east. As you approach the foothills of California after months of travel, your resources depleted and your body weathered by the journey, you catch your first glimpse of a mining camp in the distance. It's not the organized, prosperous community you imagined. It's a chaotic sprawl of tents, crude cabins, mud, and desperate men. The smell hits you first, combination of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and the distinct odor of human desperation. Welcome to your new home. The gold fever still burns, but reality is about to douse it with ice-cold mountain water. Your first glimpse of the Sierra Nevada mountains might actually take your breath away, partly from their majestic beauty, but mostly because you're probably suffering from altitude sickness. Those gorgeous peaks that look so picturesque on Instagram filters, if Instagram existed in 1849, are actually deadly barriers that have claimed countless lives of gold seekers just like you. Let's back up a bit though. Remember that journey I mentioned? Let me paint you a clearer picture of just how terrible that trek to California actually was. Imagine the worst road trip of your life, you know. The one where your car broke down, everyone got food poisoning, and you lost your wallet. Now stretch that misery over 4 to 6 months, and remove all modern conveniences, like toilets and antibiotics. If you took the overland route from the east, you'd be traveling about 2,000 miles across terrain that actively seemed to hate you. The early stretches through the Great Plains might lull you into a false sense of security. Sure, there were thunderstorms that could electrocute you and your oxen, but at least the ground was relatively flat. Then came the mountains. Oh, the mountains. The Rocky Mountains presented the first major "what have I done" moment for many gold seekers. Wagons weren't exactly designed for steep inclines, and your poor oxen, already exhausted from pulling your life's possessions for hundreds of miles now, had to somehow drag everything up mountain passes. This is where many miners made their first significant sacrifice to the gold gods, abandoning their possessions. The trails became littered with pianos, books, family heirlooms, furniture, basically anything that wasn't absolutely essential for survival. Historians have documented that the trail was so thick with abandoned property that some entrepreneurs actually made a living just collecting and reselling these items. One gold seeker wrote home, "The trail looks like a defeated army retreated along it, leaving behind everything that slowed them down." It was the Marie Kondo method of travel. But instead of asking if items sparked joy, you asked if they were worth potentially dying for. Water crossings presented another delightful challenge. Rivers that appeared shallow could have deadly undercurrents. Many a wagon was overturned, with families watching helplessly as their supplies and, sometimes their loved ones, were swept away. One particularly nasty crossing of the Green River claimed the lives of more than 30 people in a single season. That's a higher fatality rate than skydiving or bungee jumping today. Then there was the matter of navigation. You think losing signal on your GPS is bad. Try following hand-drawn maps made by people who'd never actually completed the journey themselves. One infamous cutoff, promoted as a shortcut to the goldfields, led directly into the harshest part of the Nevada desert. The Donner Party's tragic fate, just a few years earlier, was still fresh in everyone's mind. A grim reminder of what happened when you took the wrong turn. Speaking of the desert, let's talk about that special circle of hell. After the mountains came the 40-mile desert in Nevada stretch, so brutal that it was littered with the bleached bones of animals and marked by graves of those who didn't make it. The ground was often alkaline, which meant that any water you found could be toxic to both you and your animals. The heat during the day could reach 120 degrees, while nights dropped below freezing. Your skin would crack and bleed from the dry air, and your lips would split painfully. No amount of modern-day chapstick would have saved you. One gold seeker wrote in his journal, "Counted 17 dead oxen today." Past a man sitting beside his dead wife's grave, staring into nothing. He wouldn't speak or move when we offered help. These weren't unusual entries. These were Tuesday. Time worked against you too. If you left too early in the spring, mud and flooded rivers might stop you. Leave too late, and you'd face the real possibility of getting trapped by snow in the mountains. Just like the Donner Party, the sweet spot for departure was narrow, which is why the trails became so congested. Imagine the worst traffic jam you've ever been in, but it lasts for weeks. You're behind a wagon that keeps breaking down, and instead of honking, people are dying of cholera. Food scarcity became increasingly dire as the journey progressed. Game animals, initially abundant, learned to avoid the trails packed with noisy humans. Your carefully rationed supplies dwindled faster than expected. By the time many reached the Sierra Nevada, they were already suffering from malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies. Scurvy, with its bleeding gums and reopening of old wounds, became common. Your body was quite literally falling apart before you even swung your first pickaxe. Native American encounters along the trail varied dramatically. Contrary to the Hollywood version of constant attacks, many tribes actually helped lost or struggling miners. However, as more and more settlers disrupted hunting grounds and introduced diseases, conflicts did increase. Some tribes charged tolls for crossing their lands, while others engaged in raids when desperate. Remember though, from their perspective, you were part of an invasion force, destroying their way of life. It's amazing how perspective changes the narrative, isn't it? Perhaps the most underestimated challenge of the journey was the psychological toll. The endless horizon, the monotony of walking beside a wagon day after day, the constant anxiety about what lay ahead, these wore down even the most optimistic spirits. Journals from the trail frequently mention the strange phenomenon of men simply wandering off into the wilderness, never to return. Historians debate whether these were suicides, the result of mental breakdowns, or just desperate attempts to move faster without the encumbrance of the slow wagon trains. By the time you reached California, you'd likely lost at least 20 to 30 pounds, suffered from several serious illnesses, and watched multiple traveling companions die. Your resources would be nearly depleted, both financial and emotional. But hey, at least the hard part was over, right? Wrong. So very, very wrong. As you descended into California, you'd discover that the news of gold had traveled faster than you had. The early arrivals, those who were already in California when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in 1848, had claimed all the easy pickings along the American River. These 4-eighters had the incredible advantage of timing, gathering gold that literally lay gleaming in stream beds. But you, arriving with the massive wave of 49ers, would find those same streams picked clean. The final cruel joke of your journey, after traveling thousands of miles, suffering unimaginable hardships, and spending nearly everything you had, you still needed to travel further into increasingly remote areas just to find unclaimed land. And when you finally staked your claim, muddy, exhausted, and half-starved, you'd make the most devastating discovery yet. Finding gold was far, far harder than anyone had told you. But that disappointment is nothing compared to what awaits you in the mining camps themselves. Those tent cities would make modern-day music festival campgrounds look like five-star resorts in comparison. You've finally made it to the goldfields of California, your body a walking testament to the hardships of the trail. As you crest that final hill and gaze down at your destination, one of the hundreds of hastily assembled mining camps with names like Hangtown, Poverty Bar, or Murderer's Gulch real places. By the way, your heart sinks faster than a gold pan in a rushing river. From a distance, these mining camps might look like the frontier towns you've imagined, bustling with activity and opportunity. But as you get closer, the romantic vision quickly evaporates like morning mist in the California sun. What you're actually looking at is the world's most depressing Burning Man festival. Minus the art installations, and plus a whole lot more dysentery, your new home is essentially a chaotic collection of tents, crude log cabins, and canvas-covered holes in the ground that optimistic miners call shelter. The layout follows no logical pattern. Structures are crammed wherever there's space, with narrow, muddy paths winding between them. During the dry season, dust coats everything in a fine, gritty layer. During the rainy season, which you're about to discover is surprisingly intense in California, these pathways transform into knee-deep channels of mud mixed with every form of waste imaginable. And speaking of waste, let's talk about sanitation, or more accurately, the complete lack thereof. Most mining camps sprouted up with zero planning and certainly no consideration for things like sewage disposal or clean water sources. That stream you're panning for gold in, it's also where people upstream are bathing, washing clothes, and yes, relieving themselves. Think about that next time you dip your hands in to check for gold flakes. It's basically a community toilet that occasionally produces wealth. The smell is your constant companion, a pungent cocktail of unwashed bodies, rotting food, animal waste, and the distinct aroma of hundreds of men living in close quarters without modern hygiene practices. One miner wrote home, "The stench is so powerful that new arrivals often vomit upon entering camp. After 2 weeks, you either die or stop noticing it. Congratulations, your survival means your brain has simply decided to stop processing certain odors as a coping mechanism. Your housing options depend entirely on when you arrived and what resources you have left. Early arrivals or those with more money might have actual log cabins, rudimentary structures with dirt floors, but relatively weatherproof. Most miners, however, lived in canvas tents, or, if they were really desperate, brush houses made of branches and leaves. These structures offered about as much protection from the elements as an umbrella in a hurricane. Privacy, that's a luxury you left back in civilization. Your tent, or shack, likely houses multiple miners, often strangers who became roommates out of necessity. Every snore, bodily function, and midnight sob of homesickness has an audience. Personal space extends approximately 6 inches in any direction from your body. One miner wrote to his wife, "I know my bunkmate better than I know you after 10 years of marriage. I've never seen his face clearly, it's too dark at night, and we leave before dawn, but I could identify him blindfolded by smell alone." The camps were predominantly male spaces, with women making up less than 5% of the population in most mining communities during the early gold rush. This gender imbalance created a strange social environment where men took on traditionally female roles out of necessity. Laundry day in a mining camp was quite the spectacle. Hundreds of men awkwardly attempting to wash clothes in streams, with results that would make any mother weep. Some entrepreneurial women made fortunes not by finding gold, but by opening laundry services, charging up to $20, about $600 in today's money, to wash a single shirt. Weather became your nemesis in ways you never anticipated. California's Mediterranean climate means scorching summers and surprisingly wet winters. Your tent, adequate shelter in summer, becomes a soggy, moldy nightmare during winter rains. The thin canvas that barely shaded you from 100-degree heat does absolutely nothing to retain warmth when temperatures drop. Miners often woke to find snow covering their blankets after blowing in through gaps in their shelters. Historian J.S. Holliday noted that more miners died from exposure in their own beds than died in mining accidents. A statistic that really makes you reconsider your housing choices. Disease spreads through mining camps like wildfire through dry brush. The combination of malnutrition, close quarters, poor sanitation, and exhaustion created perfect conditions for epidemics. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid were constant threats. But the real killer was something miners called mountain fever, likely a combination of typhoid and malaria. One particularly nasty outbreak in 1850 killed nearly 15% of the population in some camps within weeks. There's nothing like falling asleep to the sound of gravediggers working through the night to maintain morale. And here's a fun historical fact. Lice and fleas were so ubiquitous in mining camps that men would sit around campfires at night holding their clothing over the flames to pop. The parasites, the small crackling sounds, were as common in camps as conversation. Imagine that as your evening entertainment bug popping by firelight. Netflix, it is not. The typical day begins well before dawn, because every minute of daylight is precious when you're frantically searching for your fortune. You wake on your thin bedroll, your back aching from sleeping on what's essentially a slightly softened dirt floor. Your clothes, the same ones you've worn for weeks, are stiff with dried sweat and mud. Personal hygiene consists of splashing cold stream water on your face, if you bother at all. Breakfast is a depressing affair. Typically hardtack, a biscuit so hard it could break teeth, some dried meat if you're lucky, and coffee so thick you could stand a spoon in it. This culinary delight costs about a week's worth of gold, because food prices in mining camps make modern airport restaurants look like dollar stores. Historically speaking, the isolation of these camps created bizarre economic bubbles. A dozen eggs could cost $12, about $360 in today's money. An apple, just one apple, might set you back the equivalent of $20. These prices weren't just the result of greed. The logistics of getting fresh food to remote mining camps was genuinely challenging. The result was widespread scurvy and malnutrition among miners who could spend an entire day's earnings on a single potato just to stave off disease. Perhaps the most unexpected challenge of camp life was boredom. Despite the back-breaking work, miners still had evenings to fill, and the isolation of camps meant entertainment options were severely limited. Some camps developed surprisingly rich cultural traditions, impromptu theatrical performances, music played on instruments that had somehow survived the journey, and storytelling circles. Literacy rates among miners were actually quite high for the time, and books became precious commodities, read aloud to groups until they literally fell apart from use. Historians still debate which aspect of mining camp life was most difficult psychologically. Some argue it was the constant proximity to others without privacy, while others point to the combination of physical hardship with dashed hopes. One thing is clear from the thousands of letters sent home. The reality of mining camp life shattered the golden dreams that had lured men west. As one miner wrote, "If my worst enemy suggested seeking gold in California, I would shoot him on the spot as an act of mercy." But despite everything, the filth, disease, discomfort, and disappointment, you stick it out. Because tomorrow might be the day you strike gold, and that possibility, however remote, is enough to keep you in this nightmare just a little longer. Besides, you've come too far to turn back now, both literally and figuratively. Your tent city hell is home now, at least until your luck changes or you admit defeat. And speaking of luck, you'll need plenty of it once you actually start mining, because those tools you brought along, they're about to become instruments of torture. There's something tragically ironic about Gold Rush mining equipment. You spent your life savings on these tools, hauled them thousands of miles across hostile terrain, and now they're about to repay you by destroying your body one muscle group at a time. Imagine buying a home gym that not only doesn't get you in shape, but actively tries to cripple you. That's essentially what you've done. Let's start with the most iconic piece of Gold Rush equipment, the gold pan. Seems simple enough, right? A shallow metal dish, about 16 inches across, with sloped sides. How hard could it be to use? Well, within hours of your first panning attempt, Your lower back enters a state of revolt that modern chiropractors would need a team of specialists to address. The technique requires you to bend forward at a painful angle, swirling water and sediment for hours while maintaining just the right motion to let lighter materials wash away while trapping the heavier gold. One experienced miner wrote in his journal, "After my first day of panning, I couldn't straighten my back for 3 days, slept curled like a shrimp, and walked like I'd aged 40 years overnight." Congratulations, you've achieved the physical condition of a 90-year-old in just 1 day of mining. Talk about efficiency. Here's a little-known historical fact. Many miners developed a permanent stoop that contemporaries called miner's bend, a spinal deformity caused by those endless hours hunched over streams. Some men in their 20s were described as walking with the gait of ancient grandfathers after just 1 season of panning. Think of it as an early version of Technic, but instead of getting a notification dopamine hit, you might find a tiny gold flake worth less than the permanent damage to your spine. The gold pan was actually one of the more merciful tools. As surface gold quickly disappeared, miners turned to more intensive methods requiring more devastating equipment. The rocker box or cradle was a step up in efficiency and a step down in physical comfort. Picture a wooden baby cradle with a sieve at the top and cleats inside to catch gold. One person would shovel sediment into the box, while another dumped water over it and rocked it side to side. After hours of this, your arms would feel like overcooked noodles, and your shoulders would send pain signals your brain didn't even know were possible. Then came the long tom, essentially an extended wooden sluice that required a team of miners to operate. One would shovel material in constantly, others would remove larger rocks, while others still would manage the water flow. The teamwork sounds nice until you realize you're basically part of a human machine, repeating the same back-breaking motion for 12 to 16 hours a day. Miners using long toms often developed asymmetrical musculature, one arm and shoulder significantly larger than the other, creating bodies so physically imbalanced that they walked with permanent limps. Historians still debate which mining method was physically worst for the human body. Some argue that panning, with its constant stooping, caused more long-term damage. Others point to shoveling for sluice operations, which led to more acute injuries. What's not debated is that repetitive stress injuries were so common they weren't even considered noteworthy. They were simply the cost of doing business. When surface mining no longer yielded results, you'd turn to more invasive methods, like coyoting. This delightful technique involved digging narrow vertical shafts down to bedrock, then tunneling horizontally in search of gold deposits. Imagine squeezing your body into a hole barely wider than your shoulders, with minimal bracing to prevent collapse, breathing air so stale it makes a crowded elevator seem refreshing. These tunnels were known to collapse regularly, burying miners alive. One camp reportedly had a standing crew of men whose only job was to dig out buried miners. The success rate was predictably low. The tools for this work were primitive even by 19th century standards. Pickaxes with handles that transmitted every shock directly into your joints. Shovels designed with all the ergonomic consideration of medieval torture devices. Hand drills and hammers for the unfortunate souls who moved on to hard rock mining, pounding metal spikes into solid rock for hours, rotating the drill slightly between each hit, with steel fragments occasionally flying into eyes that had no protective goggles. Here's a gruesome historical detail. Miners could often recognize each other years later by their distinctive hand injuries. Missing fingers, permanently bent joints, and hands locked into claw-like positions from nerve damage were so common they served as a kind of professional ID badge. One observer noted, "You can spot an old miner by his hands, alone gnarled like ancient tree roots, and just as rough." The physical cost wasn't limited to repetitive strain. Mining accidents were shockingly common. Rock slides, tunnel collapses, equipment failures, and explosions, once blasting powder, became common, claimed lives daily. Medical records from the period are incomplete, but historians estimate that somewhere between 10 to 15% of miners suffered serious injuries each year. In a modern workplace, this would immediately trigger federal investigations and shutdowns. In the goldfields, it was just Tuesday. Water presented another set of equipment challenges. Many promising gold deposits lay underwater in stream beds. The solution: diversion dams and water wheels to move entire rivers. These massive structures were built with hand tools and raw manpower. Imagine constructing a dam with nothing but axes, saws, and your increasingly damaged body. The work was so physically demanding that some miners simply died of exhaustion. Medical records from the period describe men who laid down after a day's work and never rose again, their hearts literally giving out from the strain. Cold water mining created its own special circle of hell. Standing in frigid mountain streams for hours led to a condition miners called footer, a type of immersion foot similar to trench foot in World War I. Your feet would become numb, then painful, then the skin would begin to slough off. Some miners lost toes to what was essentially localized frostbite. The cure was typically to rub the feet with whiskey or turpentine, a treatment that probably hurt worse than the condition itself. Even your clothing became an instrument of torture. Wool garments that never fully dried created perfect conditions for fungal infections and skin breakdown. Leather boots that alternated between soaking wet and rock hard as they dried created blisters that never healed. Hats offered minimal protection from the relentless California sun, leading to what one doctor described as brain fever, likely heat stroke, combined with dehydration. The technology did improve over time, but that actually made things worse for individual miners. As corporations moved in with hydraulic mining equipment, essentially water cannons that could tear down entire hillsides independent, miners were forced into even more marginal claims or into working for the companies under even more dangerous conditions. Progress, in this case, just industrialized the suffering. Speaking of hydraulic mining, here's a fact that might surprise you. It was so destructive that it became one of the first industrial practices in America to be banned for environmental reasons. The debris flows choked rivers, destroyed farmland, and caused catastrophic flooding in valley communities. The Sawyer decision of 1884 effectively ended large-scale hydraulic mining in California because of the human toll, mind you, but because farmers downstream had better lawyers than the miners. Miners developed their own unique tools to cope with these physical demands. Opium became widely used as a pain management strategy. Initially introduced by Chinese miners, opium smoking spread throughout the mining population as men sought relief from chronic pain. Alcohol served a similar purpose, with whiskey considered medicinal. One miner's diary entry reads, "Cannot sleep from the pain in my hands. 2 shots of whiskey makes it possible to close my eyes, or makes it possible to forget tomorrow will bring the same work." Perhaps the cruelest aspect of mining equipment was this. Despite all the suffering it caused, most miners never struck it rich. The tools that broke their bodies didn't even deliver on their golden promises. Historians estimate that fewer than 5% of miners found enough gold to return home wealthier than when they left. For the rest, the only thing their equipment reliably produced was pain. But even with better tools, you'd still be fighting a losing battle against an enemy far more powerful than equipment design: Mother Nature herself. And in the goldfields, she had a particularly vindictive streak. If you thought your relationship with the weather was complicated before, welcome to the goldfields, where Mother Nature doesn't just give you the cold shoulder. She actively tries to eliminate you from the face of the earth through an impressive arsenal of environmental weapons. Remember how weather apps sometimes get the forecast wrong and ruin your picnic plans? In the gold rush, a weather miscalculation could mean joining the growing number of shallow graves marked by crude wooden crosses. California's climate is often described as Mediterranean, which sounds delightfully pleasant if you've ever enjoyed a vacation on the Italian coast. But the reality for miners was less sipping wine on a sun-drenched terrace, and more suffering through extreme temperature swings while your body slowly fails you. The Sierra Nevada goldfields experienced temperature variations that would make your smart thermostat short-circuit in confusion. Summer days regularly topped 100 degrees, with the sun beating down on miners who had no choice but to keep working through the hottest hours. Heatstroke was so common it wasn't even considered a medical emergency. just an ordinary workplace hazard. One doctor's journal from 1850 noted, "Treated 17 cases of sun fever today. 2 died before I could administer aid. The others will return to their claims tomorrow, despite my advice." Imagine your coworker literally dying from heat at the next desk over, and your boss expecting you to just step around the body and keep typing. The historical record shows that summer temperatures in the mining regions frequently reached H-115 degrees Fahrenheit. In the valleys where many camps were located, with no air conditioning, limited shade, and the necessity of physical labor, miners developed pragmatic but disturbing adaptations. Some would work standing in streams, despite the risk of foot rot, simply to lower their core temperature. Others adopted the siesta pattern of working early morning and evening with a midday break, though this was considered lazy by the Protestant work ethic that dominated American mining culture. Then winter arrived with its own special brand of torment. The same mountains that baked you in summer now channeled Arctic air directly into your poorly insulated tent or cabin. Temperatures could plunge below freezing, with snowfall measuring several feet in higher elevations. The camps above 3,000 feet elevation could be snowed in 4 weeks at a time. One miner's letter home stated, "December brought 3 feet of snow overnight. 2 men in the next tent were found frozen by morning. We burned every piece of wood we owned, including tool handles and the frame of Johnson's gold cradle. Would have burned the tent itself if we had anything else to shelter under." Historians have documented that the winter of 1849 to 1850 was particularly severe, with over 15 feet of cumulative snowfall in some mining regions. Many camps ran out of food, creating conditions that eerily mirrored the Donner Party tragedy just a few years earlier. The death toll from that winter alone is estimated to have been in the hundreds, though exact records weren't kept. Unlike the Donner Party, these deaths didn't make national headlines, they were just considered part of the cost of seeking gold. The rain presented its own unique challenges. When it fell, it often came as a deluge that transformed mining camps into mud pits worthy of the most extreme obstacle course competitions. The packed earth floors of tents and cabins became soggy, depression-inducing swamps. Everything you owned stayed perpetually damp, creating perfect conditions for mold, mildew, and the special kind of misery that comes from never feeling completely dry. Here's a disturbing historical detail. During particularly heavy rainstorms, the hastily dug graves around mining camps would sometimes erode, exposing the decomposing remains of less fortunate miners. Several journals mention the horror of waking after a heavy rain to find a previously buried arm or leg protruding from a hillside. It's like a zombie movie, except the corpses aren't coming to eat youth, they're just there as a morbid reminder of your possible future. The environment's hostility extended beyond temperature extremes. The western mining regions were home to an impressive array of wildlife that seemed collectively offended by the miners' presence. Rattlesnakes were so common in some camps that checking your boots before putting them on became a survival ritual rather than a quirky habit. Black bears regularly raided food stores, sometimes destroying an entire season's provisions in a single night. Mountain lions, while generally avoiding human settlements, occasionally developed a taste for miner meat. One camp reportedly lost 3 men to a particularly bold cougar before they managed to hunt it down. Even the smaller creatures contributed to the miners' misery. Mosquitoes thrived in the disturbed landscapes, where mining operations created countless small pools of stagnant water. These weren't just annoying, they were vectors for malaria, which was surprisingly common in the goldfields. One mining camp doctor wrote, "I have more patients shaking with ague malaria than I have with gold fever now. The only treatment I can offer is quinine, which costs more per ounce than the gold they're finding." Scorpions, black widows, spiders, and brown recluses made themselves at home in the dark corners of miners' shelters, occasionally delivering painful or even fatal surprises. One miner's journal contains this terse entry: "Blake died this morning. Spider bite 3 days ago turned his arm black. Nothing to be done." The landscape itself seemed designed to make mining as difficult as possible. The promising gold-bearing streams were often in steep canyons with unstable slopes prone to landslides. Flash floods could sweep through these narrow valleys with little warning, carrying away equipment, supplies, and occasionally miners themselves. Historical records document numerous incidents where entire mining operations were obliterated by sudden walls of water that came roaring down canyons during heavy rains. Wildfires, a perennial California problem, were particularly devastating to mining communities. The combination of dry conditions, primitive cooking fires, and forests filled with highly flammable pine created perfect conditions for infernos. Unlike modern firefighting efforts, miners had essentially no resources to combat large blazes. When fire approached, your only option was to grab what you could carry and run. Several once booming mining camps simply ceased to exist after being completely consumed by flames. Even the geology was against you. Those picturesque mountains contained rocks laden with arsenic, mercury, and other toxic minerals that leached into water sources. Early miners had no way to test water quality and often drank from streams contaminated by natural mineral deposits, or worse, the mining activities of those upstream. Slow poisoning was so common that symptoms like weakness, hair loss, and cognitive confusion were considered normal aspects of a miner's life rather than evidence of toxic exposure. Historians now believe that many miners attributed to bad air or miasma were actually suffering from environmental poisoning. Mercury, used extensively in gold processing, caused particularly insidious damage. The phrase "mad as a hatter" originated from the neurological effects of mercury poisoning in hat makers, but could just as easily have referred to gold miners exhibiting the same symptoms. Perhaps the most bizarre environmental challenge came from the complex interaction between human activity and natural systems. As thousands of miners diverted streams, cleared forests, and dug into hillsides, they unwittingly changed local microclimates. Areas that had once been protected from extreme temperatures were suddenly exposed. Drainage patterns shifted, creating new swamps where none had existed before. It was like a primitive form of climate change happening in real time, with miners simultaneously causing and suffering from the effects. One fascinating debate among historians centers on whether the environmental conditions in the goldfields were unusually severe during the gold rush years, or if they just seemed worse because of the miners' vulnerability. Some weather records suggest that California experienced several years of greater than average rainfall and temperature extremes during the peak gold rush period. Others argue that the period was climatologically normal, but the miners, malnourished, overworked, and living in inadequate shelter, were simply more susceptible to conditions that residents might have weathered more easily. Either way, the environment extracted its own tax on the search for gold, paid in human suffering. As one miner poetically lamented in a letter home, "I came seeking fortune but found instead that nature has 1,000 ways to make a man regret his ambitions. The mountains stand like judges, the sun strikes like an executioner, and the night cold wraps around you like a shroud. If the gold is here, it seems the earth itself is determined to keep it." And despite all these environmental challenges, you still had to actually perform the mind-numbing, back-breaking daily work of a miner. Trust me, your worst Monday at the office has nothing on the daily grind of a gold seeker. Rise and shine, prospector. It's 4:30 a.m., pitch black, outside your pathetic excuse for shelter, and already 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Time for another thrilling day of back-breaking labor that will probably yield exactly nothing of value. If this were a modern job, the Glassdoor reviews would be absolutely savage. Let's walk through your daily routine as a gold rush miner, or as I like to call it, how to destroy your body and soul in 16 easy hours. First, you awaken on your bed, typically a platform of pine boughs covered with a thin blanket, or if you're living large, a straw-filled tick mattress crawling with lice. Your first conscious sensation is pain, joints stiff from cold, muscles aching from yesterday's labor, and quite possibly a persistent cough from the tuberculosis you're developing. Breakfast is a culinary delight that would make modern nutritionists faint in horror. The typical miner's morning meal consisted of sourdough bread, the starter kept alive in a pouch around your neck, salt pork fried in its own fat, and coffee strong enough to dissolve the spoon. If you were really treating yourself, you might add beans to this cardiac catastrophe. This meal cost the equivalent of about $40 in today's money, and contained enough saturated fat to make your arteries cry. A little-known historical fact: sourdough became synonymous with gold rush miners because it was the only reliable leavening available. Miners became so associated with their sourdough starters that old-timers were actually called sourdoughs. During particularly cold nights, some miners would sleep with their sourdough starter pouches to prevent them from freezing, basically cuddling with bread dough. It's both resourceful and slightly disturbing, like most survival techniques from this era. By 5:30 a.m., you're at your claim. Typically, a 10-10-foot square of streamed that you've registered with the local miners committee or simply claimed by right of being there first. Depending on when and where you're mining, the early start is crucial because every minute of daylight is precious, and you're in a race against thousands of other desperate men doing exactly the same thing. The actual work varied depending on what type of mining you were doing, but none of it was anything close to pleasant. Let's say you're engaged in place or mining, the most common method early in the gold rush, which involves separating gold from sand and gravel deposits. Your day begins with shoveling. Endless, mind-numbing shoveling. You dig gravel from the stream and load it into your equipment, a pan, rocker box, or sluice depending on your setup. A typical miner moved about a ton of material per day. That's 2,000 pounds of rocks and sand, lifted one shovelful at a time. For perspective, that's like doing a CrossFit workout for 12 straight hours, except instead of an encouraging trainer and a smoothie bar, you have dysentery and the constant fear of claim jumpers. Contemporary accounts describe miners' hands as one continuous blister during their first weeks of work. Eventually, calluses formed so thick that some men could reportedly hold burning embers without immediate pain. A party trick that surely impressed exactly no one, but does illustrate the physical transformation your body underwent. The work was not just physically demanding, but mind-numbingly repetitive. Hour after hour of the same motion, the same scrutiny of material, the same hope and disappointment. One miner wrote in his journal, "Have moved 14 wheelbarrows of gravel today. Found nothing. Yesterday, 15 wheelbarrows. Nothing. Day before, 12 wheelbarrows. Nothing. Beginning to wonder if gold exists at all, or is merely a cruel joke." This psychological toll might have been the worst part of the daily grind. Imagine the slot machine mechanics that keep gambling addicts pulling the lever. Except you're pulling that lever with muscles screaming in protest under a relentless sun while slowly starving. Each pan might contain gold, probably doesn't, but might, and that possibility keeps you going far past the point of reason. The monotony was punctuated by moments of false hope. Pyrite fool's gold caused countless heart-stopping moments of excitement, followed by crushing disappointment. Experienced miners could tell the difference easily, but newcomers often spent days celebrating their fortune before a veteran miner broke the bad news. One mining camp reportedly had a weekly fool's parade where newcomers who had mistaken pyrite for gold were marched around the camp as a form of initiation. Humiliating, yes, but afterward, you were considered properly educated. Lunchtime, if you can call it that, arrived around noon. Many miners worked through it, unwilling to lose precious time. Those who did break might have another piece of sourdough, perhaps with salt pork if they could afford it. Some ate dried fruit to prevent scurvy, though this was expensive. One miner's account mentions paying the equivalent of $80 for a small bag of dried apples, about the same as you'd pay for a decent smartphone today. Historians debate whether malnutrition or overwork caused more health problems among miners. Medical records from the period suggest both were significant factors. Doctors reported treating men in their 20s with the physical ailments of those decades older. One physician wrote, "The typical miner ages approximately 3 years for every 1 calendar year spent in the diggings. I have seen young men arrive robust and depart as shambling old men within 18 months. Water was both your essential tool and your enemy. You needed it to separate gold from sediment. But standing in cold mountain streams for hours led to a condition contemporaries called miner's rheumatism, likely a combination of arthritis and tissue damage from cold exposure. Some miners reported losing sensation in their feet and legs after just a few months of work. One particularly grim account describes a miner who only discovered he had driven a nail through his boot and into his foot when he saw the blood trail he was leaving. The cold water had so deadened his nerves he felt nothing. By mid-afternoon, fatigue became a serious safety issue. Mining accidents increased significantly during late-day hours, according to what limited records exist. Rockslides, equipment failures, and simple mistakes, born of exhaustion, claimed lives regularly. One mining camp reportedly lost 3 men in a single week to accidents that occurred after 4 p.m., more preventable had the miners been less tired or simply quit for the day. As daylight began to fade around 6 or 7 p.m., depending on the season, you'd finally end your workday. But your labors weren't over. Evening hours were devoted to maintaining equipment, cooking dinner, washing clothes if absolutely necessary, and perhaps trading news with other miners. The few hours between work and sleep were precious, but many were too exhausted to enjoy them. One miner wrote, "I intend to read this new novel that cost me a small fortune to have shipped here, but each night I find my eyes closing before I finish a single page." Dinner resembled breakfast, with perhaps the luxury of beans added to the menu. If you were in a larger camp with established merchants, you might occasionally splurge on canned goods, a technological marvel of the time, though often of dubious quality. One brand of canned peaches was so notoriously bad that miners used the cans as construction material rather than eat the contents. Still, they sold for the equivalent of $25 per can due to the desperate craving for anything other than salt, pork, and beans. The work week, all 7 days, naturally. Sundays might involve slightly less work for the religiously inclined, but the concept of a weekend would have seemed like an absurd luxury. Some camps had informal Sunday gatherings for Bible reading or impromptu church services, but many miners viewed even this brief respite as time wasted. The gold wasn't going to find itself, after all. One fascinating historical debate centers around productivity and working hours. Some economic historians argue that miners actually decreased their overall gold yield by working such punishing schedules. The exhaustion and increased accident rate likely offset any gains from the extra hours. But, in an unregulated, highly competitive environment where claims could be jumped if left unworked, miners had little choice but to maintain these brutal schedules. Sleep, when it finally came, was often interrupted by physical discomfort, the noises of camp life, or simple anxiety. Many miners reported vivid dreams of finding massive gold nuggets, only to wake to another day of finding nothing. The psychological torture of these nightly discoveries, followed by daytime disappointment, drove some men to mental breakdowns. And the truly heartbreaking part, after all this effort, the vast majority of miners barely found enough gold to cover their expenses, let alone strike it rich. Historians estimate that the average miner in 1849-1850 found about $10 minus 15 worth of gold per day, about $300 to $450 today, while spending nearly that much on tools, food, and supplies. A few struck it rich, many broke even, and a significant percentage actually lost money on their golden adventure. One miner summarized it perfectly in a letter home. "I have been in California for 7 months. In that time, I have found approximately $1,200 in gold. I have spent $1,100 on provisions and equipment. I have aged 10 years. My hands are permanently disfigured. My lungs are damaged from dust. And I have had dysentery twice. I am coming home as soon as I can afford passage. Save my place at the dinner table." But perhaps the worst part of this brutal daily grind wasn't the work itself, it was the company you had to keep while doing it. Because nothing makes back-breaking labor in horrific conditions worse than doing it surrounded by the most desperate, unhinged characters America could produce. Remember how your parents warned you to choose your friends wisely? Well, in the goldfields, you didn't get much choice at all. Your new social circle consisted of whoever happened to stake a claim near yours. And let me tell you, they weren't exactly the crème de la crème of Edo-century society. The gold rush didn't attract the cautious, well-adjusted members of society with stable jobs and loving families. It attracted gamblers, risk-takers, fugitives, and desperados, along with a healthy dose of formerly respectable men who quickly adapted to their new, lawless environment. The demographic makeup of mining camps was unlike anything else in American history. Imagine throwing together men from every state in the Union, then adding immigrants from dozens of countries, removing all women, almost eliminating law enforcement mostly, introducing extreme physical hardship, dangling the possibility of instant wealth, and adding copious amounts of whiskey. What could possibly go wrong? Let's start with your immediate neighbors. In a typical mining camp, circa 1849 to 1850, you'd find an astonishing diversity of backgrounds. The guy working the claim to your right might be a Harvard-educated lawyer who abandoned his practice for gold fever. To your left could be an illiterate farmer from Missouri who'd never left his county before heading west. Working the stream across from you might be a Chilean miner with actual experience, a Chinese immigrant with a different mining technique altogether, a free black man from Pennsylvania, an Irish refugee from the potato famine, and a German craftsman. This diversity could have been a strength and occasionally was, when different skills and knowledge were shared. But more often, it created deep divisions and tensions. These men brought their prejudices with them, and the stresses of mining life only amplified them. One miner wrote home, "The Babel of languages in camp makes simple communication a daily struggle. Men resort to gestures and crude drawings to trade or settle disputes, often unsuccessfully." The historical record shows that ethnic violence was depressingly common. The foreign miners' tax of 1850 specifically targeted Latino and Chinese miners, charging them $20 per month, about $600 in today's money, just for the right to mine. This wasn't subtle discrimination. It was explicitly designed to drive them out of the goldfields. When legal discrimination wasn't enough, vigilante violence often followed. The mining camps of California witnessed some of America's first large-scale hate crimes against Asian Americans, with entire camps of Chinese miners driven out or killed. Historians still debate the exact death toll from ethnic violence during the gold rush, but it was substantial. One particularly disturbing incident occurred at Downeyville in 1851, where a Mexican woman named Josepha was hanged by a mob after she stabbed a white miner who had broken into her home and assaulted her. The kangaroo court that condemned her ignored her pregnancy and the clear case of self-defense. This incident highlights the particular vulnerability of the few women in mining communities, especially those from minority groups. Beyond ethnic tensions, the general character of your fellow miners ranged from inspiringly noble to terrifyingly depraved. For every story of miners caring for sick comrades or sharing provisions during hard times, there are multiple accounts of claim jumping, theft, and murder. One mining camp reportedly had 17 murders in a single month, and this in a community of fewer than 500 people. That would be equivalent to over 400 murders per month in a modern city of 100,000. A fascinating aspect of Gold Rush society was how quickly men's characters seemed to change in the mining environment. Letters and journals frequently mention previously upstanding citizens transforming within weeks of arrival. One minister wrote home about a deacon from his church, "I would not have recognized James had I not known it was him. His language is now filled with profanity, he drinks heavily, and I have seen him draw a knife in a dispute over a card game. California has remade him entirely, and not for the better." The psychological phenomenon at work here has been studied by historians and sociologists. The combination of anonymity, distance from social constraints, extreme stress, and the all-or-nothing mentality of gold-seeking created perfect conditions for behavioral deterioration. It's like Las Vegas syndrome on steroids. What happens in the goldfields stays in the goldfields. Except the consequences were often fatal. Crime became so normalized that mining camps developed their own crude justice systems. In the absence of formal law enforcement, miners' courts emerged to handle disputes and punish serious offenses. These were essentially mob justice, dressed up with minimal procedure. A typical trial might last less than an hour, with punishment hanging for serious crimes carried out immediately. One observer noted, "The accused was tried, convicted, and swinging from an oak branch within 2 hours of the alleged theft. No evidence beyond accusation was deemed necessary." Claim jumping, the practice of stealing another miner's claim, was perhaps the most common serious crime. After putting weeks of work into a promising location, you might return from getting supplies to find strangers working your claim, backed by friends with firearms, who explained that this was never your claim at all. Without formal records or law enforcement, your options were limited to violence, surrendering your claim, or appealing to a miner's court that might well be friends with the very men who stole your claim. The stress of this constant threat created a state of hypervigilance among miners. Many reported sleeping with loaded weapons and developing elaborate systems to disguise any significant gold finds. Some would deliberately salt their claims with tiny amounts of gold to make them seem less productive than they were, reducing the risk of theft. Imagine having to pretend to be failing at your job because success might get you killed. Beyond the everyday criminals, the gold rush attracted some truly colorful characters who would become legendary in Western lore. Take Black Bart, for instance, a gentleman bandit who robbed nearly 30 stagecoaches, carrying gold shipments without firing a shot, or Joaquin Morita, who may or may not have been a real person, but whose legend as an avenging bandit grew so large that the California Rangers claimed to have killed him and displayed his preserved head in jars of alcohol as proof. Even more disturbing were the organized criminal gangs, like the Sydney Ducks, comprised primarily of Australian ex-convicts who terrorized early San Francisco. They repeatedly burned portions of the city so they could loot during the chaos, and controlled a violent criminal network that extorted businesses and murdered opponents. When law enforcement failed to control them, the first American vigilance committees formed in response. A lesser-known but fascinating social dynamic in the camps was the formation of partnerships. Due to the physical demands of mining and the dangers of isolation, many miners formed two-person teams for mutual protection and assistance. These partnerships often became incredibly close bonds, with men sharing everything and looking after each other like family. Some historians have noted the similarity to marriage in these arrangements, with partners dividing labor, caring for each other when sick, and even inheriting each other's possessions upon death. One miner wrote to his sister, "Davis and I have been partners for 7 months now. He cannot read, so I read him letters from his wife. I cannot cook, so he prepares our meals. When I had fever last month, he worked both our claims and his own. I would trust him with my life, and in truth, I do so daily." The gender imbalance in mining camps created other social distortions. In 1850, the ratio of men to women in California mining regions was approximately 10 to 1, and in some remote camps, it was as high as 100 to 1. This scarcity gave the few women in camps extraordinary social power, but also made them targets. A woman opening a simple boarding house or laundry service could make far more money than the average miner. One woman in Hangtown reportedly made $18,000, over $500,000 in today's dollars, in just 1 year, by operating a pie shop, charging $1 per slice for dried apple pie. Drinking defined much of the social life in mining camps. With few other recreational options, alcohol consumption reached extraordinary levels. One supply record from a medium-sized camp showed annual whiskey consumption at 56 gallons per miner, more than a gallon per week per person. Modern alcoholism treatment would have had a field day in the goldfields. The isolation and stress led to psychological problems that we would now recognize as depression, anxiety disorders, and PTSD. Without any understanding of mental health, miners typically self-medicated with alcohol or simply endured until they broke down completely. Camp journals occasionally mention men who went peculiar and wandered off into the wilderness, or who became catatonic and had to be transported back to civilization. Perhaps the most poignant accounts come from the letters miners sent home. The forced cheerfulness in these documents, even as conditions deteriorated, reveals the psychological burden of maintaining the gold dream. One miner wrote to his wife, "Fortune awaits, just around the corner, my dear. The conditions are challenging but character building. I expect to return home a wealthy man by spring." The letter was found among his possessions after his death from pneumonia 3 weeks later. Never sent. Historians have noted that these letters create a particular challenge for accurate understanding of miners' experiences. Unwilling to admit failure or worry their families, miners often painted an unrealistically positive picture in their correspondence. It's only in private journals or letters between miners that the full misery emerges, as one miner confessed in a letter to a fellow gold seeker who had already returned east. "I tell my wife that success is imminent and conditions tolerable. I cannot bear to have her know that I sleep in mud, eat food unfit for dogs, and have found barely enough gold to keep myself alive. The California dream has become my personal nightmare, but pride prevents my admission of this terrible mistake. And when your fellow miners weren't trying to rob you, kill you, or drive you out based on your ethnicity, they were inadvertently tormenting you with tales of fantastic gold strikes just over the next ridge." These stories, mostly false but occasionally true, created the phenomenon of rushing, the sudden mass movement of miners from one location to another based on rumors of new discoveries. A rush could empty an entire camp within days, with men abandoning equipment too heavy to carry in their haste to reach new diggings before they were claimed. The psychological toll of these constant rumors was devastating. Should you stay and work your mediocre claim, or risk everything on the next big strike? The fear of missing out drove rational men to irrational decisions with depressing regularity. But the worst company of all might have been the one you kept in your own head, the constant internal debate between hope and reality, between persisting and admitting defeat, because giving up meant returning home a failure, and for many, that was worse than all the physical hardships combined. But don't worry if the company you kept didn't break you. There were plenty of other ways the gold rush could crush your spirit, like the special joy of being repeatedly scammed while watching all your gold disappear into someone else's pocket. Let's talk about fool's gold in all its forms. There's a certain cruel irony to the term fool's gold. Yes, it refers to pyrite, that shiny, worthless mineral that crushed many a miner's dreams. But the real fool's gold of the gold rush wasn't a mineral at all. It was the elaborate ecosystem of scams, false hopes, and psychological traps that separated miners from their hard-earned gold faster than you can say there's a sucker born every minute. Let's start with the most basic psychological trap, the near-miss phenomenon. You spend weeks working a claim that produces nothing. You're about to give up when finally you find a small gold flake. It's not much worth, maybe $1, but its presence suggests there might be more. So you keep digging, convinced that you're on the verge of a major strike. Another week passes with nothing, then another tiny flake appears. The pattern repeats, keeping you trapped in a cycle of hope and disappointment that could stretch for months or years. This psychological mechanism is identical to what keeps gamblers at slot machines intermittent. Unpredictable rewards are more addictive than consistent ones. One miner's journal tracked this painful cycle. Found color today after 3 weeks of nothing. Jones says I should move on. Claim is played out. But I know there's more here. I can feel it. Entries like this continue for months, with occasional small finds keeping him working a claim that never produced anything significant. Historians and psychologists have noted the similarity between gold fever and gambling addiction. Both involve risk-taking, intermittent reinforcement, and the conviction that a life-changing payoff is just around the corner. In fact, one study of miners' journals found language nearly identical to that used by pathological gamblers, including magical thinking, selective memory of wins over losses, and the conviction that persistence would eventually pay off. The near-miss phenomenon was just the beginning of the psychological manipulation. Experienced miners and conmen developed elaborate scams to exploit newcomers. The classic salting scheme involved planting gold dust or nuggets in a worthless claim, then selling it to a gullible greenhorn at an inflated price. One particularly audacious scammer reportedly loaded a shotgun with gold dust and fired it into the walls of a mine before showing it to potential buyers. A fascinating historical account describes a salting technique where scammers would hollow out quartz rocks, fill the cavities with gold dust mixed with wax, then seal them closed. These doctored samples would be discovered while potential buyers were present, creating the impression of a gold-rich claim. By the time the buyer discovered the truth, the seller was long gone. The California archives contain hundreds of court cases related to mining fraud, though these represent only a fraction of the actual scams, since most victims had no legal recourse. One particularly egregious case involved a company that sold shares in a mine supposedly worth millions. Investors later discovered that the mine was just a shallow hole with a few pieces of gold-bearing quartz placed at the entrance. The company principals disappeared with an estimated $50,000, about $1.5 million today. Beyond outright fraud, there were more subtle ways miners lost their gold through poor decisions and false hopes. Merchants selling guaranteed gold-finding equipment did a booming business. One popular device was the gold detector, typically a modified compass or dipping needle that supposedly pointed toward gold deposits. These useless contraptions sold for the equivalent of thousands of dollars in today's money. One of the more bizarre examples was the divining rod market. These were supposedly magical sticks that would twitch or bend when passing over gold deposits. Some were ordinary branches, while fancier models came with brass fittings and scientific explanations about mineral magnetism. A well-made divining rod could sell for the equivalent of a month's earnings from successful mining. One merchant reportedly sold over 200 such rods in a single month, netting more gold than most miners would see in a lifetime. Historians have uncovered advertisements for even more outlandish gold-finding methods. One entrepreneur sold small vials of mercury with special gold-attracting compounds added, claiming that if buried in the ground, they would draw gold from the surrounding area into a concentrated deposit. Another sold maps, supposedly based on indigenous knowledge of gold deposits, complete with fabricated tribal symbols and mystical directions. One particularly cruel aspect of these scams was that they targeted miners at their most vulnerable when they were desperate and running out of funds. Journals and letters frequently mention miners spending their last dollars on some miracle solution, only to be left completely destitute when it inevitably failed. A miner named Thomas Wilson wrote in his diary, "Have purchased Professor Hamilton's gold attraction powder for $35, nearly all I have left. The professor guarantees it will reveal any gold within 100 feet of where it is spread. I am certain my claim has gold. It simply requires this scientific method to locate it precisely." The diary entries stop shortly after, suggesting Wilson could no longer afford paper or had abandoned his mining efforts entirely. The psychological impact of these repeated disappointments was devastating. Many miners experienced what modern psychologists would recognize as depression, characterized by hopelessness, loss of interest in activities, and in some cases, suicidal thoughts. One mining camp doctor wrote, "I observe a particular melancholy among men who have been in the diggings more than a year without success. They move mechanically, speak little, and have a vacant look in their eyes. Some stop eating and must be forced to take nourishment." This condition was so common it had its own name in mining camps: gold slump or digger's melancholy. Without any understanding of mental health or treatment options, miners typically self-medicated with alcohol or simply endured until they either struck gold rarely or gave up commonly. Adding to the psychological burden was the knowledge that some miners did strike it rich, just not you. Nothing feeds disappointment like watching others succeed where you've failed. One particularly heartbreaking journal entry reads, "Williams found a nugget weighing 37 ounces today, not 50 yards from where I've been working for 3 months. He will return home a wealthy man. I continue to find nothing." The contrast between expectation and reality created what some historians have called the gold rush cognitive dissonance. Miners arrived expecting to scoop gold from stream beds with minimal effort. The reality of backbreaking work for minimal returns created a psychological tension that had to be resolved, either by admitting failure and the accompanying shame, or by doubling down on the gold dream despite evidence to the contrary. Many chose the latter, remaining in the goldfields long after it was economically rational to do so. One fascinating historical debate centers around the letters miners sent home. Many contained wildly exaggerated claims of success and imminent wealth. Were these deliberate lies, or did they reflect the miners' genuine, if delusional, optimism? Some historians argue these exaggerations were face-saving devices, while others suggest they reflect the powerful psychological grip of gold fever, where reality becomes secondary to the dream. Even successful miners often fell victim to fool's gold of a different sort. Finding gold was only the beginning, keeping it was the real challenge. Mining camps developed elaborate ecosystems designed to separate miners from their gold as efficiently as possible. Gamblers, saloon owners, merchants, and prostitutes all had sophisticated techniques for transferring gold from miners' pockets to their own. Professional gamblers were particularly effective. Using marked cards, weighted dice, and teams of confederates, they could clean out a lucky miner in a single evening. One professional gambler's diary, discovered in recent years, contains this telling entry: "The miners work for gold, but they work for me. Let them break their backs finding it. I need only deal the cards to claim it." The psychological manipulation employed by these gamblers was remarkably sophisticated. They would allow newcomers to win small amounts initially, building confidence and encouraging larger bets. They employed shills, who would lose dramatically to the mark, making him believe he was skilled rather than being set up. By the time the miners realized they were being fleeced, their gold was gone. Alcohol played a crucial role in separating miners from their gold. Saloons charged extraordinary prices, often a pinch of gold dust about $1 to $2 per drink. A miner who struck it rich might celebrate with drinks for everyone, spending hundreds of dollars in a single night and waking with nothing but a hangover to show for his good fortune. One saloon in Sonora reportedly took in 50 pounds of gold dust in a single month, more than most miners would see in a lifetime. Even basic necessities became opportunities for price gouging. The isolation of mining camps and difficulty of transportation created perfect conditions for monopolistic practices. One mining camp store reportedly charged $1 per egg during winter months, about $30 in today's money. A pair of boots might cost the equivalent of several weeks of successful mining. These weren't necessarily scams in the traditional sense, but they ensured that even miners who found gold rarely kept enough to fulfill their dreams of returning home wealthy. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of all these schemes was the realization, usually coming too late, that the real money in the gold rush wasn't in mining gold, it was in mining the miners. The true success stories weren't the miners but the merchants who supplied them, the transporters who moved them, and the service providers who entertained them. Levi Strauss never mined a day in his life but became wealthy selling durable pants to miners. Philip Armour built his meatpacking empire with money made selling meat to mining camps at massive markups. Samuel Brannan, who famously announced the discovery of gold in San Francisco, made his fortune not from mining but by buying every pickaxe, shovel, and pan he could find and reselling them at inflated prices. This bitter irony that miners did all the work while others reaped the rewards repeatedly in journals and letters. One miner wrote, "I have labored for 6 months, suffered illness and injury, risked death daily, and accumulated $300 in gold. The man who sells me coffee and beans has accumulated thousands without leaving his store or risking anything but capital." The final psychological blow for many miners came with the realization that they had sacrificed years of their lives, their health, and often their families, for a dream that benefited everyone but themselves. This dawning awareness is captured poignantly in a letter from a miner to his brother in 1851. "The true fools are not those who mistake pyrite for gold, but those of us who mistake gold for happiness. I have seen men with pockets full of dust, more miserable than the poorest farmer back home. If you harbor any thought of joining me here, abandon it. Cultivate your land and count yourself fortunate. But even if you somehow avoided all these scams and psychological traps, kept your gold, and maintained your sanity, you still faced the most basic and persistent challenge of mining life, simply staying alive when everything you ate and drank seemed determined to kill you. You know how people today obsess over organic food, count calories, and freak out about gluten? Well, Gold Rush miners had slightly different dietary concerns, like whether their dinner would cause immediate death or just prolonged suffering. When it came to food and water in the goldfields, the question wasn't, is this healthy? But rather, will this definitely kill me today? Or can I postpone that until tomorrow? Let's start with water, that most basic necessity. You'd think that in the pristine mountains of California, clean water would be abundant. You'd be catastrophically wrong. Mining operations quickly contaminated virtually every water source in the goldfields. The process of separating gold from sediment muddied streams for miles downstream, creating water so thick with silt you could practically chew it. One miner described the water in his camp as liquid mud with occasional clarity, rather than clear water with occasional mud. But turbidity was the least of your worries. Mercury poisoning presented a far more insidious threat. Miners used mercury, then called quicksilver, extensively in gold recovery, particularly in sluice boxes and cradles. This toxic metal bound with gold, creating an amalgam that could be separated later by heat and air, process that released mercury vapor into the air and liquid mercury into the water. Miners handled this dangerous substance with bare hands, often with open cuts, allowing direct absorption into the bloodstream. Historical records show that symptoms of mercury poisoning, tremors, memory problems, emotional instability, and nerve damage were extremely common in mining camps, though rarely recognized as such. Miners called these symptoms mining sickness or blamed them on bad air, not realizing they were slowly poisoning themselves and their water supply. One doctor's journal from a mining camp noted, half the men exhibit the shakes, memory lapses, and unpredictable rages. I suspect foul miasmas from the disturbed earth, though liquor no doubt contributes. Modern environmental studies have found mercury contamination in Sierra Nevada watersheds that can be directly traced to gold rush mining activities. That's right, the toxic legacy of mining operations is still detectable in California's environment 170 years later. This contamination was so severe that it affected food chains, with fish in mining areas accumulating dangerous levels of mercury, another hazard for miners who supplemented their diets with local catches. Beyond mercury, the water in mining camps harbored a veritable zoo of disease-causing organisms. With no understanding of germ theory and minimal sanitation, miners routinely dumped human waste upstream of where others collected drinking water. The result was predictable: dysentery, typhoid, and cholera spread through camps like wildfire. One mining camp reportedly lost 20% of its population to a single cholera outbreak in 1850. These weren't gentle illnesses, they involved violent, dehydrating diarrhea that could kill within days or even hours. A particularly disturbing historical detail: some mining camps developed informal rotations for water collection duties, with upstream positions being most desirable. Those forced to collect water downstream would often boil it or add whiskey in a primitive attempt at purification. The whiskey did nothing to kill pathogens, but made the muddy, contaminated water somewhat more palatable and, perhaps, numbed the drinker to the inevitable intestinal consequences. If water was problematic, food presented its own special horrors. The typical miner's diet was not exactly what today's nutritionists would recommend. The staples were beans, salt pork, often rancid, and sourdough bread, a nutritional profile roughly equivalent to eating nothing but bacon and bean burritos for months on end. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, became so common that miners' teeth routinely loosened and fell out. One miner reported in his journal that he could wiggle all his teeth with his tongue and expected to be toothless within the year. Historians have analyzed supply records from mining camps and discovered that the average miner consumed between 4,000 to 5,000 calories daily necessary for the intense physical labor, but received almost no fresh fruits or vegetables. The few fresh items that did reach remote camps sold for astronomical prices. One apple could cost a full day's gold earnings. A single orange might sell for the equivalent of $50 in today's currency. These weren't luxury items, they were life-saving medicine for men suffering from scurvy, and they were priced accordingly. Food preservation in the era before refrigeration relied on salt, smoking, or drying. The results were often barely recognizable as food. Salt pork frequently arrived already rancid, particularly in summer months, or after long journeys to remote camps. Miners developed a disturbing technique for determining if meat was edible. They would place it near an anthill. If the ants avoided the meat, it was too far gone even for desperate miners. If the ants swarmed it, it was considered still good enough for mining camp. A fascinating historical debate centers around the psychological impact of this monotonous, deficient diet. Some scholars argue that the constant hunger, nutritional deficiencies, and digestive distress contributed significantly to the mental health issues prevalent in mining camps. The combination of physical discomfort, nutritional deficiencies affecting brain function, and the psychological strain of never feeling properly nourished created conditions perfect for depression and irrational behavior. When fresh meat was available, it came with its own risks. Game animals were initially abundant but quickly became scarce around established camps. Hunting parties had to venture increasingly far from camp, and the meat often spoiled before it returned. Without refrigeration, a deer killed in the morning might be dangerously putrid by evening on a hot summer day. Miners developed the charming habit of slicing off the most obviously rotten portions and cooking the rest, a practice that led to regular bouts of food poisoning. Cooking itself presented challenges. Most miners had minimal culinary skills, not surprising given the gender dynamics of the era. Their cooking equipment consisted of a single cast iron pan, perhaps a Dutch oven if they were lucky, and an open fire. The results were predictably disastrous. One mining camp doctor reported treating more burns from cooking accidents than mining injuries, as men unused to food preparation set themselves on fire with alarming regularity. A particularly amusing historical account describes a mining camp cooking competition held as entertainment during winter months, when mining slowed. The judge, a rare woman in camp who ran a boarding house, reportedly tasted the first entry and immediately vomited. Rather than being offended, the miners took this as valuable culinary feedback, and the competition continued, with the winner being the man whose dish induced the least violent physical reaction. Storage of food created additional hazards. Mining cabins and tents were routinely invaded by rodents, insects, and larger scavengers like raccoons and bears. Food was typically hung from rafters in canvas bags, but these deterrents were minimally effective. Miners would regularly discover that their precious flour had become home to weevils, or that mice had nested in their bean supply. Rather than discard this contaminated food, unthinkable luxury, they would simply cook it anyway, picking out the larger insects and ignoring the rest. One miner wrote home, "Found a family of mice living in our flour sack today. Picked out the obvious droppings and made biscuits anyway. Such is life in the diggings. A man who demands clean food will soon be a hungry man, and shortly thereafter, a dead one." Canned foods, a relatively new technology at the time, offered some variety but came with their own dangers. Early canning processes were primitive, and botulism was a constant risk. Furthermore, these cans used lead solder, creating a slow-acting poison that accumulated in miner systems over time. Some historians have suggested that many mysterious illnesses and deaths in mining camps may have actually been cases of lead poisoning from canned foods, though this remains difficult to prove definitively. Another historical curiosity: the gold rush coincided with the early commercial ice trade, where ice cut from northern lakes was shipped globally in insulated ships. Some larger mining towns occasionally received shipments of this ice, creating brief windows where perishable foods could be preserved. The arrival of an ice shipment was cause for celebration, with miners paying exorbitant prices for the luxury of a cool drink or briefly preserved fresh food. One account describes miners paying a full pinch of gold, dust about $1 to $2, just to hold a piece of ice in their hands on a hot day. Alcohol consumption, while technically not food, was a major component of miners' diets. Whiskey was often safer to drink than water, though its quality was questionable at best. Much of what passed for whiskey in mining camps was actually raw alcohol diluted with water and flavored with tobacco, peppers, or other additives to give it color and burn. This concoction, often called tarantula juice or miner's dynamite, could cause blindness, nerve damage, or death, depending on what exactly went into the mix. One particularly gruesome account from a mining camp doctor describes treating a man who had consumed whiskey containing wood, alcohol, methanol, resulting in blindness and eventual death. The doctor noted that such cases were common, with the typical treatment being to induce vomiting and administer more, hopefully better quality whiskey as an antidote. This cure was based on the correct theory that ethanol would be metabolized preferentially over methanol, but the execution in mining camps was haphazard at best. Coffee was the other beverage of choice, though what passed for coffee would horrify modern baristas. Miners would boil the same coffee grounds repeatedly until they disintegrated, resulting in a progressively weaker but increasingly bitter brew. When coffee beans weren't available or were too expensive, substitutes like roasted acorns, chicory, or even charred bread were used. The resulting beverage provided caffeine and warmth, if nothing else. The final insult in this dietary horror show was the price. Mining camp merchants charged astronomical amounts for these dubious provisions. A barrel of flour that cost $4 in New York might sell for $50 in a remote mining camp. Coffee might cost the equivalent of $100 per pound in today's currency. These prices meant that miners often spent virtually all their gold on basic sustenance, creating a cycle where they had to keep mining just to afford the food that kept them barely alive enough to continue mining. One miner summarized the situation perfectly in a letter home. "I have found approximately $600 in gold over 4 months of grueling labor. Of this, $550 has gone to purchasing food that would be rejected by pigs back home. I subsist on beans, rancid pork, and bread that could serve as building material. We drink water that is visible to the naked eye and whiskey that would strip paint. And yet, I count myself fortunate, as Johnson died last week from what the camp doctor called intestinal rebellion. His last meal was identical to mine, and if you somehow survived the food and water, you still had to contend with illness and injury in a place where medical care ranged from primitive to actively harmful, because nothing says adding insult to injury quite like gold rush medicine. If you think modern healthcare is expensive and frustrating, imagine a medical system where the treatment was often worse than the disease. Doctors might have learned their craft by shoeing horses, and your health insurance plan consisted entirely of try not to die. Welcome to medicine on the mining frontier, where the Hippocratic oath of first do no harm was more of a distant aspiration than an actual guideline. Let's start with the medical professionals themselves, the term I use in the loosest possible sense. In the early gold rush, virtually anyone could declare themselves a doctor and set up practice. There were no licensing requirements, no medical boards, and certainly no Yelp reviews to warn you about the physician who thought bleeding was the appropriate treatment for a broken leg. Many mining camp doctors had no formal training whatsoever, while others had backgrounds as barbers who traditionally performed bloodletting and minor surgeries. Butchers, they knew how to cut things, or veterinarians, close enough, right? The historical record contains some truly hair-raising accounts of these self-proclaimed medical experts. One mining camp journal describes a Dr. Simmons who claimed to have studied at the finest medical colleges in Europe, but was later discovered to have been a carnival barker whose primary medical experience involved selling patent medicines made of colored alcohol. Another account mentions a surgeon who performed amputations with a carpenter's saw that he wiped clean on his pants between patients. That said, there were legitimate doctors in the Goldfields. Brave, educated men who brought actual medical training to the frontier. However, even these trained physicians were working with medical knowledge that we would find shockingly primitive today. In the 1850s, germ theory was not yet widely accepted. Anesthesia was in its infancy, with ether and chloroform just beginning to replace alcohol as the primary means of managing surgical pain. Antibiotics wouldn't exist for another 80 years. A fascinating historical debate centers around whether formally trained doctors actually provided better outcomes than the self-taught practitioners. Some historians argue that the academic medicine of the era, with its emphasis on bloodletting and calomel, a mercury-based purgative, was potentially more harmful than the pragmatic approaches developed by frontier practitioners. Others maintain that trained physicians, despite their theoretical limitations, brought valuable surgical skills and observational methods that improved survival rates. The doctor-patient ratio in mining camps would make modern hospital administrators have a stroke. In early mining camps, there might be one physician of dubious qualification for every 500 to 1,000 miners. Some remote camps had no medical help at all within several days' journey. One miner's journal notes, "Harrison cut his leg badly with a pickaxe yesterday. The nearest doctor is in Marysville, for days' travel. We cleaned the wound with whiskey and said a prayer. Nothing else to be done." Speaking of whiskey, it served as the primary anesthetic, disinfectant, and painkiller in mining camps. Before operations, patients would be encouraged to drink until they passed out, or at least became insensible to pain. During particularly gruesome procedures, fellow miners might be enlisted to physically restrain the patient. One mining camp doctor's journal contains this chilling entry: "Amputated Johnson's left arm today following crushing injury in a claim collapse. 4 men held him down. Used my good saw. Patient screamed considerably, despite nearly a quart of whiskey. Expect fever will follow as usual." The doctor's expectation of fever was well-founded. Without antiseptic techniques, post-surgical infections were the norm rather than the exception. In the pre-antibiotic era, these infections frequently proved fatal. Historical records suggest that the mortality rate following major surgeries in mining camps was between 50 to 80%, with most deaths occurring from subsequent infection rather than from the procedure itself. Medical supplies were both scarce and primitive by modern standards. A typical doctor's kit might contain a saw for amputations, forceps for extracting bullets or other foreign objects, a probe, often a long silver rod, for exploring wounds, catgut for sutures, and a limited selection of drugs, primarily laudanum tincture of opium, calomel, quinine, and various purgatives designed to cleanse the body by inducing violent diarrhea. Medications of the era were, to put it mildly, problematic. Mercury compounds were prescribed for everything from constipation to syphilis, slowly poisoning patients while rarely addressing the underlying condition. Arsenical compounds were commonly used to treat fevers and skin conditions, with predictably toxic results. Strychnine, now recognized as a deadly poison, was prescribed as a stimulant and tonic for patients suffering from fatigue or depression. One particularly disturbing historical account describes a mining camp doctor who treated nervous exhaustion with a combination of strychnine and whiskey, a cocktail that modern toxicologists would consider a particularly efficient way to kill someone. The patient reportedly recovered, though one suspects this was despite the treatment rather than because of it. The concept of specialized medicine barely existed. The same doctor who delivered babies would also amputate limbs, treat gunshot wounds, and prescribe for venereal diseases. Mining camp physicians were the ultimate generalists, expected to address any medical condition with their limited supplies and knowledge. One doctor's ledger from a Sierra Nevada camp lists treatments provided in a single day: delivered Mrs. Johnson's infant healthy boy, set Jackson's broken arm, removed bullet from Carson's shoulder, lanced Ferguson's abscess, pulled 3 teeth, and treated 5 cases of dysentery. Common mining injuries created particular challenges for these frontier physicians. Crush injuries from cave-ins or equipment accidents frequently required amputation in an era before reconstructive surgery. Eye injuries from flying rock fragments or metal splinters often resulted in blindness. as ophthalmology was rudimentary at best. Burns from black powder explosions, once gangrenous, typically meant limb removal as the only hope for survival. A little-known historical fact: some mining camp doctors became adept at performing surgery by candlelight, developing techniques specific to operating in near darkness. These included using their sense of touch to compensate for poor visibility and employing assistants whose sole job was to hold mirrors to direct available light into body cavities during operations. These adaptations were necessitated by the realities of frontier medicine, where waiting for daylight might mean the difference between life and death. Dental problems created their own special category of mining camp misery, with diets high in sugar and flour, minimal oral hygiene, and the effects of tobacco chewing and pipe smoking. Dental decay was rampant. Treatment consisted primarily of extraction, performed without anesthesia using primitive dental forceps, or, in some cases, pliers. Some mining camp dentists developed a reputation for speed, priding themselves on completing an extraction in under 10 seconds, small comfort to the patient experiencing those 10 seconds. One miner wrote home, "Had a molar pulled by Campbell yesterday. The pain beforehand was considerable, but nothing compared to the extraction itself." Campbell uses a set of blacksmith's tongs, modified for the purpose. The procedure was completed quickly, but I would rather work double shifts for a month than experience it again. Epidemic diseases presented the greatest medical challenge in mining camps. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, and various forms of mountain fever, likely including typhus and malaria, swept through camps with terrifying regularity. Without understanding of germ theory or effective treatments, these outbreaks often claimed 10 to 20% of a camp's population. Quarantine was the only effective control measure, but it was difficult to implement in the transient mining community. A particularly devastating smallpox outbreak in 1852 killed thousands across the mining regions. Vaccination against smallpox existed but was not widely available in remote camps. Some entrepreneurial doctors traveled between camps offering vaccination for a pinch of gold dust, but many of these were frauds administering useless or even harmful substances. One account describes a vaccination that consisted of making a small cut and applying a poultice of mud and herbs, a procedure more likely to cause infection than prevent smallpox. Malaria deserves special mention as a persistent problem in the goldfields. The foothills of the Sierra Nevada provided ideal breeding conditions for mosquitoes, and the disease was endemic in many mining regions. Quinine, derived from cinchona bark, was the only effective treatment, but supplies were limited and expensive. Without understanding the mosquito vector, miners attributed the shaking fever to miasmas, bad water, or night airs. Some camps were abandoned entirely after particularly severe outbreaks, with miners believing the location itself was cursed or poisonous. Mental health issues were common but poorly understood. The combination of isolation, physical hardship, dashed hopes, and alcohol abuse created perfect conditions for depression, anxiety, and what would now be recognized as PTSD. Treatment options were limited to laudanum, which was addictive, alcohol, which exacerbated the problems, or the water cure, essentially dousing the patient with cold water to shock them back to normalcy. One mining camp doctor wrote with surprising insight, "Many men suffer from a melancholy that no physical treatment seems to touch. They lose interest in their claims, stop eating, and waste away despite having no identifiable disease. I suspect the mind affects the body in ways our medical knowledge cannot yet comprehend. Injuries and illnesses affected more than just the individual miner. In an economy where physical labor was the only path to wealth, disability meant financial ruin. Mining partnerships often included informal insurance arrangements, with healthy partners working the claim of an injured or ill member until recovery. However, with severe injuries or chronic illness, these arrangements eventually collapsed, leaving the disabled miner destitute. One particularly poignant journal entry describes a miner named Anderson who lost his leg after a mining accident. Anderson was the strongest man in camp before the timber fell on him. Now he sits outside the general store, selling matches and pencils. Few buy from him. Most avoid his gaze. We all fear becoming him. Medical costs could be astronomical, often paid in gold dust, measured on scales at the doctor's office. A typical fee for setting a broken bone might be an ounce of gold, equivalent to about $1,500 to $2,000 in today's currency. Major surgeries could cost several ounces, representing months of successful mining. Many miners simply couldn't afford treatment and either suffered without medical care or relied on campmates with minimal medical knowledge. Some mining camps developed rudimentary mutual aid societies, where miners contributed to a common fund that would pay for medical care when needed. These early health insurance systems typically covered only catastrophic injuries rather than routine care, and they frequently collapsed when too many members required assistance simultaneously, such as after a mine collapse or during an epidemic. Self-medication was the norm rather than the exception. Patent medicines, often containing alcohol, opium, and various questionable ingredients, were popular despite their high cost. These concoctions, with names like Dr. Parker's Golden Relief or Oriental Pain Extractor, promised to cure everything from cancer to baldness. Most were, at best, ineffective, and at worst, actively harmful. One of the more bizarre treatments popular in mining camps was the application of various animal products to wounds. Bear grease, considered to have special healing properties, was applied to everything from burns to bullet wounds. Freshly killed chickens were split open and applied to deep cuts, supposedly to draw out the poison. These folk remedies reflected the desperate measures taken when proper medical care was unavailable. Perhaps the most telling commentary on Gold Rush medicine comes from a letter written by a mining camp physician to his colleague back east. "I have practiced medicine for 20 years, the last 3 in the goldfields of California. In Boston, I lost perhaps 1 patient in 20. Here, I lose 1 in 4, despite employing identical treatments. I have concluded that the difference lies not in the quality of care, but in the conditions of life. The hardships of mining damage the body's natural healing capability beyond what our medical arts can address. A minor illness that would inconvenience a man in civilization proves fatal here. I sometimes wonder if I do any good at all." Despite these grim realities, mining camp doctors were often respected community members who provided what help they could under impossible circumstances. Many worked for minimal compensation or accepted payment in goods rather than gold from miners who couldn't afford their services. These frontier physicians, whatever their limitations, represented the thin line between the complete absence of medical care and the rudimentary assistance they could provide. And while doctors might treat your physical ailments or make them worse trying, there was another profession that specialized in emptying both your pockets and your dreams: the merchants and suppliers, who discovered that the real gold mine was selling goods to desperate miners. The economics of the goldfields were about to teach you a harsh lesson in supply and demand. If there's one unshakable truth about gold rushes throughout history, it's this: the people who consistently made the most money weren't the ones obsessively panning streams or digging into mountainsides. They were the clever folks selling shovels, beans, and whiskey to the miners, while you were breaking your back for gold flakes. The real fortune builders were charging you $25 for a pair of boots that cost $3 back east. Welcome to the economic reality of the gold rush, where the dream of striking it rich quickly gave way to the nightmare of barely affording basic necessities. The economic distortions of the gold rush created what modern economists would call a bubble economy on steroids. Imagine the most outrageous price gouging you've ever experienced. Maybe that $15 beer at a concert, or $12 airport sandwich, and multiply it by 10. Then imagine that instead of being a one-time annoyance, these prices applied to everything you needed to stay alive. Let's start with the basics. Food. In San Francisco in 1849, a single egg could cost the equivalent of $25 in today's currency. A loaf of bread might run you $15. A pound of coffee, that bitter, essential fuel for early morning mining, could set you back the equivalent of $1,200 in modern dollars. One particularly notorious meal at a San Francisco hotel in 1849 consisted of 2 eggs, a piece of toast, coffee, and a small steak. The price, an ounce of gold, worth approximately $1,800 to $2,000 today. As you moved farther from supply centers into remote mining camps, prices escalated even further. Historical records show that in distant camps during winter months, flour could sell for $400 per barrel, about 20 times its cost in New York. Fresh fruits and vegetables, when available at all, commanded astronomical prices. One miner's journal records paying 1 pinch of gold dust, about $1 to $2 or $30 to $60 today, for a single apple. He noted, "It was small, half-rotten, and the most delicious thing I have ever tasted." A fascinating historical debate centers around these price distortions. Some economic historians argue they represented rational market responses to genuine scarcity and transportation challenges. Others suggest systematic profiteering and cartel-like behavior among suppliers. The truth likely involves both factors, with legitimate supply difficulties creating opportunities for coordinated price manipulation. Equipment was similarly overpriced. A standard mining pan that cost 25 cents in the East might sell for $15, about $450 today in the goldfields. Shovels and pickaxes sold for 10 times their normal value. Even basic items like matches and candles commanded premium prices, with miners paying the equivalent of $30 for a small box of matches that would cost pennies elsewhere. One particularly egregious example of equipment pricing comes from the mercury trade. Mercury or quicksilver was essential for separating fine gold from sediment, but supplies were limited. Traders charged up to $100 per flask, about $3,000 today, knowing miners had no alternative. Some unscrupulous merchants reportedly cut their mercury with lead or other metals, creating a product that was both less effective and more toxic, a double blow to the desperate miners. Clothing represents another category of extraordinary markup. The harsh conditions of mining life meant clothing wore out quickly, requiring frequent replacement. A pair of boots might last 3 weeks of daily mining before becoming unwearable. At $25.50 per pair, about $750 to $1,500 today. This created an ongoing expense few miners had anticipated. One miner wrote home that he had spent more on boots in 6 months than he had on his house back in Ohio. Levi Strauss famously built his denim empire by recognizing miners' need for durable work pants. His riveted jeans, introduced in 1873 during the later phases of the gold rush, commanded premium prices but lasted far longer than conventional trousers. Miners willingly paid extra for clothing that could withstand the rigors of their work, creating a market dynamic where higher prices could actually represent value if the quality justified the cost. Housing costs in established towns near mining regions reached levels that would make modern San Francisco real estate look reasonable by comparison. In 1849, a small lot in San Francisco sold for $10,000, about $300,000 today, before anything was built on it. Simple wood frame buildings rented for astronomical sums, leading to extreme overcrowding as miners packed into shared spaces to split the cost. One particularly absurd housing situation developed in early San Francisco, where abandoned ships in the harbor were converted into makeshift hotels and businesses. As sailors deserted to seek gold, their vessels remained anchored in the bay, gradually being repurposed as warehouses, saloons, and lodging houses. Several streets in modern San Francisco actually run over these buried ships, which were gradually engulfed as the waterfront was filled in during later development. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of gold rush economics was the cycle of dependency it created. A miner might spend all his earnings on basic necessities, forcing him to continue mining just to survive, regardless of whether his claim was productive. This created a form of debt peonage, where miners became trapped in the goldfield, unable to afford either the supplies needed to continue or the transportation costs to leave. Merchants developed sophisticated systems to perpetuate this cycle. Many offered credit to miners, knowing that once indebted, the miners would be bound to the gold fields until they paid off their accounts. Interest rates on these informal loans were astronomical, often 10% per month or higher. One merchant's ledger from 1850 shows numerous miners carrying debt balances equal to 6 months of average gold findings, mathematical proof of economic entrapment. This system was particularly devastating for miners working marginal claims. They might find just enough gold to avoid starvation without ever accumulating enough to pay off their debts or return home. Historical records contain numerous accounts of miners writing home to request funds for return passage, having spent years in the goldfields with nothing to show but debt and broken health. One especially poignant letter reads, "I have been in California for 3 years now. In that time, I have found perhaps $3,000 in gold, a sum that sounds considerable until I account for my expenses, which have totaled nearly $2,900. I have damaged my lungs, developed chronic rheumatism, lost for teeth to scurvy, and aged 20 years in appearance. I beg you to send $100 for passage home, as I cannot bear another winter here." Transportation costs represented another major drain on miners' resources. Moving goods into remote mining regions required teams of pack mules navigating treacherous mountain trails. Freight charges often exceeded the value of the goods themselves. One supply record shows that transporting a barrel of flour from Sacramento to a mining camp 50 miles away cost more than the flour itself. These transportation costs were passed directly to the miners, who had no alternative sources for essential supplies. A curious economic phenomenon developed around bulk goods versus luxury items. Basic necessities commanded the highest markups, while certain luxury goods sold for relatively reasonable prices. Champagne sometimes sold for less per volume than clean drinking water in remote camps. This pricing anomaly reflected the essential nature of water versus the optional nature of champagne, despite the higher base cost of the latter. When you're dying of thirst, water becomes priceless regardless of its production cost. Banking and financial services in the goldfields operated on similarly extractive principles. With few formal banks, miners relied on express companies like Wells Fargo to store or transport their gold. These services charged substantial fees, typically 2 to 5% of the value simply for secure storage. Sending gold home might cost 10% of its value in fees and insurance. Modern bankers would salivate at these profit margins. Currency exchange provided another opportunity for financial predation. With no standardized currency, goldfields commerce operated on a complex system of gold dust, foreign coins, and privately minted gold coins of questionable purity. Merchants maintained scales to weigh gold dust for purchases, and many kept their thumbs literally on the scale or used calibrated weights that benefited themselves. One miner noted, "Every purchase requires negotiation, not just of price, but of the value of whatever you're paying with. I've seen men argue for an hour over the weight of a pinch of dust." Some merchants developed a reputation for honest dealing, while others became notorious for their exploitative practices. In the absence of regulation or legal recourse, a merchant's reputation represented their only accountability. Mining camps occasionally took direct action against particularly egregious price gougers, with informal miners' committees establishing maximum prices or, in extreme cases, physically running exploitative merchants out of camp. One dramatic account from a mining camp near Placerville describes miners seizing a merchant's goods and auctioning them at fair prices after he tripled his rates during a winter shortage. The merchant was given the proceeds minus a fine for profiteering and escorted out of camp with a warning never to return. This frontier justice reflected the desperation and solidarity that could develop among miners facing common exploitation. Not all merchants were villains, of course. Many took genuine risks, bringing supplies to remote locations, and faced their own hardships. Pack trains were subject to robbery, weather damage, and accidents on treacherous trails. A merchant who lost a shipment to bandits or a river crossing gone wrong could face financial ruin. These legitimate business risks justified some premium over normal prices. though rarely to the extremes commonly charged. Some of the most successful gold rush merchants were themselves former miners who recognized the better business opportunity. One notable example was Sam Brannan, who made a modest find at Sutter's Mill but realized the real fortune lay elsewhere. He purchased every pickaxe and shovel in San Francisco before news of the gold discovery became widely known, then sold them at enormous markups when the rush began. Within months, he was making more from his store than all but the luckiest miners made from gold. Perhaps the most economically devastating aspect of mining camp commerce was the alcohol trade. Whiskey sold for $16 per gallon, about $500 today. Yet consumption remained high despite the cost. Many miners spent significant portions of their earnings on alcohol, creating a transfer of wealth from those who produced gold to those who produced or distributed spirits. One mining camp saloon reportedly took in more gold dust in a month than the average miner found in a year. The final economic irony of the gold rush was that as more gold entered circulation, inflation reduced its purchasing power. The massive influx of California gold into American and world markets during the 1850s caused significant price increases nationwide. This meant that even miners who did manage to save substantial amounts found that their gold bought less than expected when they finally returned home. Their years of sacrifice yielded returns diminished by the very commodity they had worked so hard to extract. One returning miner wrote with bitter insight, "I departed in 1849 believing $5,000 in gold would make me a wealthy man for life. I return in 1853 with $7,000, only to find that it purchases less than $5,000 would have before I left." The cruel joke of the goldfields is that we miners dug up so much gold that we devalued the very thing we sought. Economic historians now view the California gold rush as a fascinating case study in boomtown economics, resource extraction, and wealth distribution. The majority of the wealth generated ultimately flowed not to the miners who performed the physical labor of gold extraction, but to the merchants, transporters, and service providers who supplied them. This pattern has repeated in virtually every resource boom since, from oil fields to cryptocurrency. For individual miners, the economic reality of the gold rush represented a harsh lesson in the gap between dreams and reality. Most discovered too late that while gold itself might be free for the taking if you could find it, everything else required to stay alive while looking for it came at a price few had anticipated or could sustain. But even if you somehow managed to navigate this economic minefield, you still had to contend with the complex, often dangerous legal landscape of the mining frontier, where justice was as elusive as a rich gold vein and nearly as valuable. In the modern world, we take certain legal realities for granted. If someone steals your stuff, you call the police. If a business partner cheats you, you sue them. If you're accused of a crime, you get a lawyer and a fair trial. Well, guess what didn't exist in early gold rush camps? Police, courts, lawyers, or anything remotely resembling due process. Welcome to frontier justice, where the line between law and chaos was thinner than gold leaf and just as easily torn. The legal situation in Gold Rush, California, created one of history's most fascinating examples of spontaneous legal order emerging from chaos. When miners first poured into California in 1848 to 49, they entered a bizarre legal limbo. The territory had just been acquired from Mexico through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but Congress hadn't yet established territorial government, let alone statehood. Mexican law technically still applied, but there was no mechanism to enforce it. Military governors had nominal authority but lacked the manpower to police remote mining regions. The result? Mining camps created their own legal systems from scratch, developing a unique form of frontier democracy that combined high ideals with sometimes brutal enforcement. These miners' courts operated on simple principles: immediate justice, majority rule, and punishments severe enough to maintain order in communities where men outnumbered law enforcement by hundreds or thousands to one if law enforcement existed at all. A fascinating historical debate centers around these spontaneous legal systems. Some historians view them as remarkably fair and effective given the circumstances, examples of democratic principles adapting to frontier conditions. Others emphasize their summary nature and harsh punishments, seeing them as little more than mob justice with minimal procedural protections. Both perspectives capture different aspects of this complex reality. The basic functioning of miners' courts followed a consistent pattern across different camps. When a serious crime occurred, theft, claim jumping, assault, or murder, miners would gather, elect a judge and jury for that specific case, hear evidence, deliberate briefly, and render an immediate verdict and sentence. The entire process might take less than a day, from crime to punishment. One miner described the process in his journal. Williams was caught this morning stealing gold from Peterson's sluice box. Camp meeting called for noon. Judge Brown elected to preside. 12 men chosen by lot for jury. Williams permitted to speak in his defense, but offered only drunkenness as excuse. Jury deliberated for 15 minutes. Verdict: guilty. Punishment: 39 lashes and banishment from camp. Sentence carried out immediately. The punishments available to miners' courts were limited by practical considerations. With no jails or long-term detention facilities, options included fines, whipping, banishment, or hanging. Minor offenses typically resulted in fines or a public flogging, with 39 lashes being a common sentence derived from the biblical 40 lashes minus 1. More serious crimes, particularly murder or major theft, often led to hanging or banishment, the latter being potentially a death sentence if the banished person had to travel through hostile territory without supplies. The miners' courts operated on a criminal standard of proof that would horrify modern legal scholars. While serious crimes like murder generally required substantial evidence, lesser offenses might be proven by reputation or minimal circumstantial evidence. One particularly troubling aspect was the treatment of non-white defendants, who routinely received harsher punishments than white miners for identical offenses. Mexican, Chinese, and indigenous defendants were frequently hanged for thefts that would earn a white miner a whipping or fine. A particularly disturbing example comes from a camp near Sonora, where historical records show that a Mexican miner was hanged for stealing a gold pan worth perhaps $5, while the same week, a white miner caught stealing gold dust worth over $100 was simply banished. This racial disparity in justice was common throughout the goldfields, and reflected the deeper prejudices of American society at the time. Beyond criminal matters, miners' courts also established the fundamental rules governing mining claims. These claim systems were remarkably sophisticated and became the foundation for formal mining law later adopted by the US government. The basic principle was straightforward. A miner could claim a limited area, typically 10 feet along a stream or 100 square feet, for dry diggings, mark it with stakes, and maintain ownership through continuous work. Abandoning a claim for a specified period, often 3 to 10 days, depending on the camp, meant forfeiting it to whoever claimed it next. These claim rules reveal a fascinating economic understanding. By limiting claim size, the system prevented wealthy individuals from monopolizing large areas. By requiring continuous work, it discouraged speculation and maximized productive activity. These principles reflected the miners' practical wisdom and their commitment to giving each man a fair chance at finding gold. One particularly interesting legal innovation was the mining district itself, a defined geographic area with its own specific rules voted on by the miners within it. California contained hundreds of these districts, each with slightly different regulations adapted to local conditions. Miners in one district might allow claims of 10 feet, while a neighboring district might permit 15 feet claims. This local adaptation created a natural experiment in rule optimization, with successful rules spreading to other districts through imitation. Historians have noted the remarkable similarity between these spontaneous legal arrangements and theoretical models of common law development, where legal systems evolve organically through practical problem solving rather than central planning. What makes the gold rush example particularly fascinating is the speed of this evolution. Rules that might take centuries to develop in traditional common law emerged within months in the pressure cooker environment of the goldfields. Property rights in mining camps extended beyond claims to include rudimentary personal property protections. However, these protections varied dramatically based on the item in question. Mining equipment left at a claim was generally considered inviolate. Stealing tools was a serious offense, potentially punishable by death. In contrast, communal use of cooking equipment and food was often accepted or even expected. One miner noted, "A man who touches another's mining pan risks hanging. But borrowing a coffee pot without asking merits barely a harsh word." The most sacred property in camp was, unsurprisingly, gold itself. Theft of gold dust or nuggets typically resulted in the most severe punishments, regardless of amount. Historical records document cases of men being hanged for stealing amounts worth less than $20. This severity reflected not just the material value but the symbolic importance of gold as the whole purpose of the mining community's existence. Physical security in mining camps operated on the principle of armed deterrence rather than organized protection. Nearly every miner owned at least one firearm, typically a revolver or rifle, and carried it openly. This universal armament created a state of mutual deterrence that sometimes prevented crime, but also meant that when violence did erupt, it could quickly become deadly. One mining camp doctor recorded treating 16 gunshot wounds in a single month, 5 of them fatal. Dispute resolution for non-criminal matters followed similar improvised patterns. Disagreements over claim boundaries, water rights, or personal conflicts might be settled through informal arbitration by respected camp members. Direct negotiation between parties, often at gunpoint, or formal presentation to a miners' meeting. The guiding principle was typically expediency rather than perfect justice. Solutions that allowed mining to continue without disruption were preferred over technically correct but complicated resolutions. A particularly fascinating aspect of gold rush legal history concerns contracts and debt enforcement. With no formal courts to enforce agreements, miners developed alternative mechanisms to ensure compliance. Reputation became crucial. Currency: a man known to break his word would find no one willing to partner with him or extend credit. Some camps maintained informal blacklists of individuals who had failed to honor debts or agreements, effectively ostracizing them from economic participation. For more formal arrangements, miners sometimes created written contracts with built-in enforcement mechanisms. One common approach was the hostage method, where each party would entrust something valuable to a neutral third party, to be forfeited if they failed to fulfill their obligations. Another technique involved public pledges before the mining camp, creating community pressure to comply with agreements. Banking and financial services operated in a similar legal gray area, with few formal banks. Miners often entrusted their gold to express companies like Wells Fargo or to merchants with secure safes. These arrangements relied entirely on the company's reputation rather than legal guarantees. When Adams and Company, a major express firm, failed in 1855, many miners lost their entire savings with no legal recourse. This devastating event emphasized the precarious nature of property rights in the goldfields. Law enforcement, such as it was, fell to vigilance committees in larger settlements and to the mining community as a whole in smaller camps. These vigilance committees began as ad hoc responses to specific crime waves but sometimes evolved into more permanent, quasi-governmental organizations. The San Francisco Committee of Vigilance, formed in 1851, effectively took over the city's law enforcement functions, trying, convicting, and hanging alleged criminals without any legal authority. Historians remain divided on how to interpret these vigilance movements. Some see them as necessary adaptations to frontier conditions where formal law enforcement was absent or corrupt. Others view them as dangerous examples of mob rule that undermined due process and disproportionately targeted minorities and the poor. Both perspectives capture elements of the complex reality, where the line between community, justice, and lynch mob could blur disturbingly. The legal status of non-Americans in the goldfields created additional complications. When California entered the Union in 1850, it immediately passed the foreign miners tax, requiring non-citizen miners to pay $20 monthly, later reduced, for the privilege of mining. This tax targeted Mexican, Chinese, Chilean, and other foreign miners, effectively forcing many to abandon their claims. The law represented one of America's first explicitly discriminatory tax policies and revealed the xenophobic undercurrents that would shape California's development. Indigenous Californians faced even greater legal challenges. Not recognized as citizens and increasingly displaced from their traditional lands by mining operations, native peoples existed in a legal limbo that offered minimal protection. Attacks on indigenous communities were rarely punished, and their claims to land or resources were routinely ignored. One particularly disturbing aspect of Gold Rush history is the state-sponsored genocide against California's indigenous population, where militias received government payments for killing native people under the guise of protection. As California transitioned from frontier chaos to statehood, formal legal institutions gradually extended into the goldfields. County courts, sheriffs, and eventually state mining regulations began to replace the improvised justice of the early rush. This transition created its own tensions, as miners accustomed to direct democratic participation often resisted external authority imposed by distant officials. One particularly interesting legal development was the incorporation of many miners' court principles into formal U.S. mining law. The Mining Law of 1872, which still governs hard rock mining on public lands today, codified many practices developed spontaneously in California mining camps, including claim staking procedures, work requirements, and size limitations. This represents a rare case where frontier improvisation directly shaped formal national legislation. Perhaps the most telling commentary on Gold Rush justice comes from a letter written by a miner named Thomas Weller to his brother in 1851. The law here exists in theory but functions by convenience. A man with friends may violate it with impunity, while a stranger may hang for a minor transgression. I have seen justice administered with wisdom that would impress the finest courts back home, and I have seen it perverted to serve prejudice and personal vendetta. Each man carries his own law in his pocket in the form of a Colt revolver, making this place both more lawful and more lawless than any I have known. This paradoxical quality, simultaneous order and chaos, justice and injustice, defined the legal landscape of the goldfields. For miners, it meant sleeping with one eye open and one hand on your weapon, never knowing if the law would protect you or become the instrument of your destruction. But even with all these legal perils, a miner still needed some form of escape from the grinding daily reality of the goldfields. And that's where an entirely different set of dangers awaited in the form of the vices and entertainments that flourished in every mining camp, ready to separate you from your gold dust through methods far more pleasant but equally effective as outright theft. After months of back-breaking labor, eating beans that could double as construction material, and sleeping in a tent that leaks more than the Trump administration, you finally accumulated a small pouch of gold dust. Congratulations. Now comes the hard part: keeping it. Because mining camps offered a dizzying array of temptations designed to separate you from your hard-earned gold faster than modern streaming services, multiplying on your credit card statement. Welcome to the world of mining camp vices, where saloons, gambling halls, brothels, and various other entertainment establishments formed the social center of Gold Rush communities. These weren't just places to blow off steam, they were sophisticated economic engines that effectively recycled gold from miners' pouches back into circulation, ensuring that even successful miners often ended up broke. Let's start with the most ubiquitous vice: alcohol. Saloons were typically the first permanent structures in any mining camp, sometimes appearing before actual mining began. A typical mining camp saloon was a crude affair, perhaps a canvas tent with a plank bar in the early stages, eventually upgrading to a rough wooden structure as the camp became established. Despite their rustic appearance, These establishments charged metropolitan prices. A shot of whiskey might cost a pinch of gold dust, roughly $1 to $2, equivalent to $30 to $60 in today's currency. The quality of this whiskey would horrify modern drinkers. Most was adulterated with everything from water, the least offensive additive, to tobacco juice, cayenne pepper, gunpowder, or even strychnine to give it kick. This concoction, variously called tanglefoot, tarantula juice, or coffin varnish, could cause blindness, nerve damage, or death, depending on what exactly went into the mix. One miner's journal contains this telling entry. Simmons died last night after consuming 3 drinks at Burke's saloon. The doctor says the whiskey had wood alcohol in it. Burke claims it was Simmons' weak constitution, not his spirits, that caused the death. Beer and wine were safer but even more expensive due to transportation challenges. A bottle of champagne might sell for the equivalent of $300 to $500 in today's currency, making it a display of extreme wealth in mining communities. Some miners who struck it rich would ostentatiously order champagne just to wash their hands or rinse the mud from their boots, a display of newfound prosperity that established their status while simultaneously beginning the process of returning their gold to circulation. Historians debate whether alcoholism rates were actually higher in mining camps than in mainstream society, or just more visible due to the concentrated, predominantly male population. What's clear is that alcohol consumption was extraordinary by modern standards. Supply records from several camps suggest an average consumption of 1 to 2 gallons of spirits per miner per month, a rate that would classify virtually every regular drinker as a heavy alcoholic by current medical definitions. The social function of saloons extended far beyond simply providing alcohol. They served as the community's living room, post office, news center, hiring hall, and general meeting place. For miners living in cramped tents or crowded boarding houses, saloons offered the only comfortable indoor space available for socializing. One miner wrote home, "The saloon is our church, courthouse, theater, and social club combined. All significant business happens at Quinn's Bar, from claim sales to marriage proposals to funeral arrangements." Gambling represented the second major vice of mining camps, often occurring within the same saloons that served liquor. Games of chance offered miners the alluring possibility of multiplying their gold findings overnight without the backbreaking labor of actual mining. Of course, the mathematical reality ensured that most miners lost money over time, especially when playing against professional gamblers who followed the gold rush specifically to prey on miners. The most popular gambling games included Faro, Monte, Poker, and Chuck-a-Luck. Faro in particular attracted heavy betting, with miners sometimes wagering months of findings on a single turn of the cards. Professional gamblers employed a variety of cheating methods, from marked cards and rigged wheels to confederates who signaled information about opponents' hands. One particularly elaborate scam involved hollowed-out rings containing tiny mirrors that allowed dealers to see cards as they were dealt. A fascinating historical account describes a professional gambling team that worked mining camps along the American River in 1852-51. The team included a dealer, a lookout, and a champion, a team member who posed as a lucky miner and won conspicuously early in the evening to encourage others to play. This sophisticated operation reportedly collected over 30 pounds of gold dust worth well over $1 million today, in a 6-month period before angry miners discovered the cheating and ran them out of the region. The psychological appeal of gambling was particularly strong in the mining context. Miners were already engaged in a higher risk, higher reward activity by searching for gold. This self-selected population of risk-takers naturally gravitated toward gambling's similar dynamics. Furthermore, the grinding uncertainty of mining where weeks of work might yield nothing created a desire for the immediate resolution that gambling provided. Win or lose, at least you knew the outcome right away. One miner explained the appeal in a letter home. Mining itself is a gamble where weeks may pass before knowing if your bet on a particular claim was wise. At the faro table, I know within minutes if fortune favors me. There is a certain relief in this immediacy, even when I lose. Professional gamblers developed specialized skills for separating miners from their gold dust. They learned to identify which miners had recently struck color, found gold by watching, who was buying drinks or speaking excitedly. These newly lucky miners became prime targets, as they were often both flush with gold and convinced of their good fortune. One gambling house operator's journal contains this cynical observation: "The best customer is not the richest miner, but the luckiest recent one. A man who finds gold today believes he cannot lose tonight. This belief costs him dearly." Sex work represented another major industry in mining communities with their overwhelming gender imbalances. In early mining camps, the ratio of men to women could be 100 to 1 or higher. This scarcity created economic opportunities for women willing to work in the sex trade, where earnings could be extraordinary by 19th century standards. Historical records suggest that successful sex workers in established mining towns could earn more in a month than schoolteachers or nurses made in a year. The economics of sex work in mining communities reflected these extreme gender imbalances. A private dance might cost a full pinch of gold dust, $1 to $2, or $30 to $60 today, while an evening's company could cost multiple ounces of gold. One particularly renowned woman in Sonora reportedly charged an ounce of gold, approximately $1,800 to $2,000 in today's value, for an evening and had more customers than she could accommodate. The reality of sex work in mining camps was complex and defies simple categorization. While many women were exploited, others exercised significant agency and business acumen. Some became wealthy property owners and influential community members. The story of Artoy, a Chinese immigrant who became one of San Francisco's most successful brothel owners, demonstrates the potential for economic advancement through this controversial industry. Historians have documented a hierarchy within mining camp sex work, from high-status courtesans who served wealthy clients in relative comfort to women working in crowded crib districts under dangerous, exploitative conditions. This stratification often followed racial and ethnic lines, with white women typically occupying higher status positions, while Mexican, Chilean, Chinese, and indigenous women faced greater exploitation and violence. A disturbing historical fact concerns the trafficking of women and girls to mining regions. With the enormous demand for female company, criminal networks developed to transport women, sometimes willingly, often under false pretenses or coercion, to mining communities. Chinese women, in particular, were frequently brought to California through debt bondage systems that amounted to slavery. The Page Act of 1875, ostensibly passed to prevent forced labor, was primarily used to exclude Chinese women from immigration under the presumption they were all coming for immoral purposes. Beyond alcohol, gambling, and sex work, mining camps offered various other entertainments designed to separate miners from their gold. Traveling shows featuring musicians, actors, or novelty performances commanded high prices for providing brief escapes from the harsh mining reality. One particularly successful performer, Lola Montez, toured mining towns with her infamous spider dance in the 1850s, charging admission equivalent to a full day's mining proceeds. Blood sports represented another popular diversion. Boxing matches, wrestling contests, and animal fights attracted enormous crowds and heavy betting. Cockfighting was particularly widespread, with prized fighting roosters sometimes selling for ounces of gold. Bear baiting, pitting captured bears against dogs or bulls, drew especially large crowds. Despite, or perhaps because of its brutality, these spectacles reflected the frontier culture's comfort with violence and its constant search for intense experiences to counter the monotony of mining life. Opium presented a more insidious escape. Initially introduced by Chinese immigrants who used it both medicinally and recreationally, opium smoking spread to the wider mining population as men sought relief from physical pain and psychological distress. Unlike alcohol, which encouraged sociability, opium promoted withdrawal and private escape. One mining camp doctor wrote with concern, "The opium habit spreads among white miners at an alarming rate. Men who begin using it for legitimate pain relief continue for the dreamlike escape it provides from our harsh circumstances. The economics of these various vices revealed sophisticated business models adapted to the peculiar conditions of mining communities, with a customer base that had irregular income, potentially nothing for weeks. Then sudden wealth, with a lucky strike. Vice industries developed flexible pricing and credit systems. Saloons, gambling houses, and brothels would carry miners during dry spells, then collect handsomely when they found gold. This credit system created dependency relationships that kept miners tethered to particular establishments. One particularly effective business strategy involved combining multiple vices under one roof. The most successful establishments offered alcohol, gambling, women, and entertainment in a single location, creating a complete experience that could separate a miner from all his gold in a single evening. These early integrated entertainment complexes represented a frontier version of the modern Las Vegas casino model, where multiple temptations create a disorienting environment specifically designed to lower inhibitions about spending. The physical design of these establishments incorporated surprisingly sophisticated psychological elements. Saloons typically featured large split mirrors behind the bar, nominally decorative but strategically placed to let bartenders and house gamblers watch everyone in the room. Lighting was carefully arranged to illuminate gambling tables while keeping patrons' faces partially shadowed, making it harder to detect reactions to cards or dice. Even the free food commonly offered, the original bar snacks, was heavily salted to encourage more drinking. Mining camp entertainment followed predictable boom-bust cycles tied to gold production. When a new strike occurred, Vice Industries rapidly deployed to the location, sometimes arriving before the majority of miners. These advanced teams of saloon keepers, gamblers, and sex workers would secure the best physical locations and establish operations before competition arrived. When a camp's production declined, these same businesses would quickly dismantle and move to the next promising location, often leaving before most miners recognized the gold was playing out. The relationship between mining camp vices and community development followed a fascinating pattern. In the earliest stage of a camp, Vice Industries dominated the economy and physical landscape. As camps matured, churches, schools, and family-oriented businesses emerged, creating tension between competing visions of community. This pattern of first sin, then salvation repeated across hundreds of mining settlements. One observer noted, "The saloon arrives with the first miner, the church with the first family, and the constant battle between them defines our growing communities." The moral economy of mining camp vices revealed complex attitudes that defy simple categorization as either acceptance or condemnation. Most miners participated in these activities while simultaneously acknowledging their problematic nature. Letters home often contain detailed descriptions of saloon visits and gambling, alongside moral reflections about the destructive nature of these same activities. This cognitive dissonance, enjoying vices while condemning them, created a distinctive cultural perspective where participation and criticism coexisted. One miner captured this contradiction perfectly. "I spend more evenings at McGinty's saloon than I care to admit, losing gold at Monty and drinking whiskey of dubious origin. I recognize the self-destruction in these habits even as I continue them. Perhaps tomorrow I will reform, but tonight the faro table calls, and its voice is louder than my conscience." For many miners, these vices represented not just entertainment, but necessary psychological escape from the brutal reality of mining life. The temporary relief provided by alcohol, gambling, companionship, or opium made the grinding hardship of daily existence just barely tolerable. One miner wrote with painful honesty, "Without the Saturday night relief of whiskey and cards, I do not believe I could face another week of back-breaking labor for what increasingly seems a fool's dream of gold." And even as you indulged in these questionable pleasures, your mind was likely elsewhere, thinking of the family and home you left behind. The vast distance between you and your loved ones created perhaps the most painful aspects of mining life, the emotional isolation and communication struggles that made the physical hardships even harder to bear. "Dearest Martha, I pray this letter finds you and the children in good health. So began thousands of letters scratched out by candlelight in drafty tents and crude cabins across the goldfields. The distance between you and your family back home wasn't just measured in the 2,000+ miles you'd traveled to reach California. It was measured in months of silence, missed birthdays, unshared sorrows, and the growing realization that the life you left behind was continuing without you. Communication during the gold rush existed in a twilight zone between the ancient and modern worlds. The telegraph wouldn't reach California until October 1861, meaning that, for the majority of the gold rush, communication relied on physical letters carried by stagecoach, steamship, or private express companies. The challenges of this system created delays that are almost unimaginable in our age of instant communication. Let's put this in perspective. Today, you might feel anxious if someone doesn't respond to your text within hours. During the gold rush, you might not receive a response to your letter for 4 to 6 months. Imagine texting your spouse a question in January and getting the answer in July. That's assuming, of course, that your letter arrived at all, which was far from guaranteed. The logistics of mail delivery created the first major hurdle. For letters traveling between California and the eastern states, there were 3 primary routes, all problematic. The fastest was the Panama route, where mail traveled by steamship to Panama, crossed the isthmus by mule and canoe, later by railroad, then continued by steamship to California. Under ideal conditions, this route took about 30 to 40 days each way. However, it was vulnerable to tropical storms, shipwrecks, and outbreaks of disease like yellow fever and malaria. The second route went around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, a journey of 15,000 nautical miles that took 3 to 8 months, depending on weather conditions. This route was more reliable than Panama, but painfully slow. The third option was the overland route across the American continent, which was faster than Cape Horn but subject to seasonal closures, indigenous conflicts, and bandit attacks. Once your letter reached California, it still had to find you no small challenge, given the transient nature of mining life. If you'd moved from one camp to another in search of better prospects, your mail might chase you across the Sierra foothills for months, passed from hand to hand by travelers who might or might not remember to deliver it. One miner recorded receiving a Christmas letter from his wife in August of the following year, after it had followed him through 5 different mining camps. Historical records contain numerous accounts of miners receiving death notifications months after the fact. One particularly poignant journal entry reads, "Received word today that my son William died of fever last November. He was buried before the ink was dry on the letter I sent him last fall. I have been a father speaking to a ghost these 6 months." The psychological impact of such delayed grief is difficult to fathom in our age of immediate information. The cost of sending mail created another barrier. Postage in the early gold rush era was expensive by contemporary standards, 25 cents, about $8 in today's currency, to send a letter from California to the East Coast. For miners struggling to find enough gold to feed themselves, this represented a significant expense. The result was a painful calculus. How often could you afford to write home? What news was worth the cost of postage? Private express companies like Adams and Company and Wells Fargo offered faster service at even higher prices. Wells Fargo charged $1 per letter in 1851, about $30 today, a premium price that many miners paid willingly for faster delivery. These companies maintained elaborate networks of riders and offices, creating an alternative postal system that frequently outperformed the official U.S. mail. A fascinating historical detail concerns slim letters. Paper itself was expensive in mining regions, selling for up to 50 cents per sheet, about $15 today. To maximize the value of this precious commodity, miners developed a technique of cross-writing, filling a page with normal horizontal lines, then turning the paper 90 degrees and writing across the same page vertically. The resulting grid of intersecting text was difficult to read, but doubled the content of each valuable sheet. Some particularly determined correspondents even wrote diagonally across the already cross-written pages. creating a dense palimpsest that required extreme patience to decode. Historians examining these cross-written letters have noted that they represent not just economic necessity, but psychological desperation. The need to communicate exceeded the constraints of the medium. One cross-written letter in the California State Archives contains approximately 3,000 words on a single sheet of paper, equivalent to about 10 pages of normal correspondence. The writer concludes with a touching apology. "Forgive the confused nature of this letter, but paper is dear and my thoughts of you too numerous for conventional writing." The emotional impact of communication delays created a distinctive psychological phenomenon that some historians have called emotional desynchronization. Families separated by months of communication lag experienced different emotional realities. A husband might still be grieving a miscarriage while his wife had already moved through that grief. A wife might be celebrating good news that had turned sour before her letter of congratulations even arrived. This emotional misalignment created a strange form of isolation even when communication occurred. One particularly heartbreaking example comes from a collection of letters between a miner named James Wilson and his wife Sarah. In March 1852, Sarah wrote announcing she was pregnant with their first child. The letter took 3 months to reach James, who responded with joy. His response took another 3 months to reach Sarah, who, by then, had miscarried. Her letter informing him of the loss crossed paths with his celebration, creating a painful emotional tangle that took months to unravel. Beyond practical information, letters served crucial emotional purposes. They maintained connections, reinforced identities beyond miner, and provided psychological anchors to miners' pre-gold rush lives. Many miners reported reading and rereading letters until they fell apart, sleeping with them under their pillows, or carrying them in breast pockets close to their hearts. One miner wrote that his wife's letters were more precious than any gold I might find, for they remind me I remain human in this place that strips away civilization. The content of these letters followed revealing patterns. Letters from home typically emphasized normality and continuity, children growing, seasons changing, community events continuing. These domestic details provided miners with reassurance that their world remained intact despite their absence. Letters from miners to their families typically emphasized hope, progress, and imminent success, even when reality was far grimmer. This epistolary optimism reflected both the miners' own need to justify their absence and their desire to spare families worry. A study of preserved gold rush correspondence found that miners typically waited 6 to 12 months before sharing significant hardships or failures with their families. This delay created a temporal cushion. By the time families learned of past difficulties, the miner could present them as already overcome. One revealing example comes from a miner who wrote in June 1851, "I was terribly ill with fever last December, but have fully recovered now." He shared a life-threatening illness only after 6 months had passed, converting a cause for alarm into a demonstration of resilience. The psychological burden of maintaining optimism in correspondence became increasingly heavy as the reality of mining life failed to match initial expectations. Many miners found themselves trapped in narrative prisons of their own making. Having promised imminent success in early letters, they felt unable to admit continued failure months or years later. One miner confessed in a letter to a fellow miner who had returned east, "I tell my wife and parents that fortune is just around the corner, that next month will surely bring the strike that makes our separation worthwhile. I have been saying this for 2 years now. The truth, which I share only with you, is that I have found barely enough gold to survive, and have nothing to show for my labors but ruined health." This pattern of epistolary deception created long-term complications for miners who eventually returned home, having portrayed their experience as more successful than it was. They faced difficult reckonings with families who expected returning heroes rather than broken, impoverished men. Some historians have suggested that this expectation gap contributed to high rates of family dissolution following miners' returns. As the reality of their experiences and financial situations finally became clear, For the many miners who never wrote home at all, silence created its own painful dynamics. Families left without word might spend years wondering whether their husband, father, or son was dead, delayed, or simply had abandoned them. Newspapers in eastern states regularly published lists of men who had left for California and not been heard from since, pleading for information about their fate. Many of these mysteries were never resolved, creating permanent emotional limbo for those left behind. A particularly painful historical detail concerns the California widows, women who never received official notification of their husbands' deaths but eventually had to accept the likelihood and move on with their lives. Without death certificates or reliable information, these women occupied an ambiguous legal and social position, neither widowed nor married. Some states eventually passed laws allowing women to petition for legal declarations of death after specified periods of absence, but the emotional closure remained elusive. Photography offered one partial solution to the emotional distance. Daguerreotypes' surly photographs on silver-plated copper became popular keepsakes for separated families. Miners would carry these images of loved ones across the continent, while families back home treasured images of their gold-seeking men. These precious objects provided visual connection when physical presence was impossible. One miner's journal mentions looking at his wife's daguerreotype each night before sleep, to remind myself of the purpose behind this madness. The technological limitations of early photography created their own emotional complications. Daguerreotypes required subjects to hold perfectly still for extended periods, resulting in stiff, solemn expressions rather than natural smiles. Children, who struggled to remain motionless, often appear blurred or grim. These formal, sometimes severe images could intensify rather than relieve the emotional distance, providing visual confirmation of presence but little emotional reassurance. For miners without literate family members, communication presented additional challenges. Some relied on community letter writers or readers to bridge this gap, sacrificing privacy for connection. Others used symbolic objects to communicate across literacy barriers. A pressed flower, a small gold nugget, or a lock of hair could convey meaning when words were inaccessible. These physical tokens took on enormous emotional significance, becoming tangible connections across vast distances. Beyond letters, miners created community-based communication systems to share news from home. When newspapers arrived from eastern states, they would be read aloud in camps, with miners gathering to hear news from their home regions. These collective readings created temporary communities of shared background, with men from the same state or region finding connection through common knowledge of places and events. One miner described these gatherings as the closest thing to church in the goldfields, a communion of shared memory. The unreliability of information created constant anxiety. Rumors of deaths, disasters, or political changes circulated through mining camps, often distorted beyond recognition by the time they reached remote areas. Without means to verify this information, miners lived with chronic uncertainty about matters of vital importance to them. One journal entry captures this frustration. Heard today that Boston burned to the ground last month. Tomorrow we will likely hear it stands untouched. Which to believe? The torture of not knowing the truth about home exceeds any physical hardship of mining life. As the gold rush progressed, communication gradually improved. The Butterfield Overland Mail established regular stagecoach service in 1858, reducing letter transit times to about 25 days. The completion of the Transcontinental Telegraph in 1861 allowed near-instant communication at extraordinary cost. The first telegrams cost $1 per word, about $30 in today's currency, limiting their use to the wealthy or emergency situations. The Pony Express, while short-lived, operating only from April 1860 to October 1861, captured public imagination as a heroic effort to connect California with the eastern states. Relay riders could deliver mail between St. Joseph, Missouri, and Sacramento, California, in just 10 days, an astonishing achievement that briefly transformed communication, before being rendered obsolete by the telegraph. During its brief existence, The Pony Express carried nearly 35,000 pieces of mail, providing unprecedented connection for those who could afford its premium rates. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Gold Rush communication was the final letter phenomenon. Thousands of miners, realizing they were dying from disease, injury, or exhaustion, wrote farewell letters to loved ones they would never see again. These letters typically combined practical information about any gold or possessions to be forwarded home with intensely personal final messages. Museum collections preserve hundreds of these unmailed final letters, found among the effects of miners who died before they could send their last words home. One such letter, now in the Oakland Museum of California, reads in part, "My dearest wife, I feel the fever will take me before morning. I have asked Williams to send what little dust I have accumulated along with this letter. Know that my last thoughts are of you and our children, and my greatest regret is that I sought fortune so far from home only to find that my true wealth was what I left behind." For most miners, the emotional toll of separation eventually outweighed the increasingly unlikely prospect of striking it rich. Letters home frequently mentioned homesickness as a greater hardship than physical dangers or discomforts. One miner wrote, with simple eloquence, "I can endure bad food, cold, disease, and back-breaking labor. What I cannot bear much longer is not seeing your face or hearing our children's voices. Gold is cold comfort for such absence." And as the months stretched into years, with that golden dream remaining elusive, you had to face the question that haunted every miner. Was any of this worth it? Had you sacrificed your health, years of your life, and time with your family for nothing but a fool's errand? The hard truth about success rates in the goldfields suggested an answer few wanted to hear. So, after everything, the grueling journey, the filthy camps, the back-breaking labor, the illness, the legal chaos, the vice-ridden evenings, and the heartbreaking separation from loved ones, the question remains, was it all worth it? Did miners actually strike it rich? Did you finally find that glittering motherlode that justified all your suffering? Let's look at the cold, hard numbers, which, much like your mining pan, at the end of most days, contain very little gold. The brutal reality is that the vast majority of Gold Rush miners never struck it rich. Historical data and contemporary accounts suggest that fewer than 5% of miners found enough gold to return home significantly wealthier than when they left. For the remaining 95%, the Gold Rush represented a break-even proposition at best, and a devastating financial loss at worst. One mining camp physician wrote in his journal, "For every man who finds fortune, I treat 50 who find nothing but broken health and empty pockets." The statistics become even more sobering when we consider actual earnings versus expectations. The average miner in the early rush, 1848-1849, might find $20 worth of gold per day, equivalent to about $600 to $700 in today's currency. This sounds impressive until you factor in the cost of living in mining regions, where basic supplies cost 5 to 10 times their normal prices. After expenses, many miners who seemed successful by raw production numbers were barely breaking even. By 1851 to 1852, average daily findings had dropped to $10 or less, as the easily accessible placer gold was exhausted. By 1853, the typical miner might find only $5 worth per day, barely enough to cover basic expenses. A mining camp merchant's ledger from this period shows that the average miner spent $4.50 daily on food, supplies, and minimal recreation, leaving just 50 cents in accumulated wealth from a successful day of mining. Historians debate the exact economic outcomes for individual miners, but most agree on a pattern of diminishing returns over time. The earliest arrivals, particularly those already in California, when gold was discovered in 1840, I had the highest success rates. These 4-eighters sometimes found gold literally lying in stream beds, ripe for the taking. By contrast, those arriving during the height of the rush, in 1849 to 1850, faced more competition and depleted surface deposits. Those who came after 1851 encountered increasingly difficult conditions, requiring more sophisticated and expensive mining techniques. A fascinating economic study of gold rush outcomes divided miners into quintiles based on their arrival dates. The first quintile, earliest arrivals, showed a roughly 15% rate of significant financial success. The last quintile, those arriving after 1852, showed less than 1%, achieving similar outcomes. This stark difference reflects not just the depletion of easily accessible gold, but also the increasing commercialization and industrialization of mining, which shifted opportunities away from individual prospectors toward companies with capital for hydraulic operations and deep shaft mining. Personal narratives from unsuccessful miners reveal the psychological impact of these disappointing outcomes. One particularly poignant letter from a miner to his wife in 1852 reads, "I have been in California for 2 years now. In that time, I have endured illness, injury, and hardships I never imagined possible. All this I could bear if the gold were real. But after 2 years of labor, I have accumulated less than $300 above my expenses. At home, working in the mill, I could have earned more while sleeping under our roof each night and watching our children grow." The contrast between expectations and reality created what some historians have called gold rush cognitive dissonance. Having invested so much financially, physically, and emotionally in the gold dream, many miners found it psychologically difficult to abandon the pursuit, even when evidence of its futility mounted. This helps explain why many remained in the goldfields long after it became economically irrational to do so. One mining camp doctor observed, "Many men stay not because success remains likely, but because leaving means admitting failure. They would rather continue suffering than return home defeated." For those who did find significant gold, keeping their wealth presented its own challenges. The lawless nature of early mining camps made wealthy miners targets for theft, or worse. Historical records contain numerous accounts of successful miners who were robbed or murdered while attempting to transport their gold to San Francisco or back east. One particularly notorious incident occurred along the American River in 1851, where 3 miners carrying an estimated $18,000 in gold dust, over $500,000 today, were found murdered, their gold missing. Even miners who safely transported their gold home often discovered that their fortune provided less security than anticipated. Inflation, spurred in part by the massive influx of California gold into the economy, eroded the purchasing power of their hard-won wealth. A miner returning east in 1853 with $5,000, a substantial sum representing years of successful mining, found that rising prices had reduced its effective value by nearly 30% compared to pre-gold rush standards. The physical and psychological costs further complicated the calculation of success. Many miners who found modest financial success did so at the cost of permanent health damage. Respiratory diseases from dust exposure, joint deterioration from cold and repetitive labor, mercury poisoning from gold processing, and various injuries created lifelong disabilities. One returning miner wrote, "I have brought home $3,000 in gold and a body aged beyond its years. The gold will be spent on doctors attempting to repair the damage done earning it." A particularly interesting historical debate centers around counterfactual outcomes, what miners might have accomplished had they never joined the rush. Economic historians have attempted to model likely outcomes for miners had they remained in their previous occupations and invested the money spent on the gold rush adventure. These models suggest that for the average participant, traditional work and modest investment would have produced greater wealth than mining over the same period. One concrete example comes from a carpenter named James Wilson, who left Boston for the goldfields in 1849. Records show he spent approximately $600 on travel and initial supplies, equivalent to about a year's wages in his trade. After 3 years of mining, he returned with $2,200 in gold. During this same period, carpenters in Boston saw wage increases of about 15% annually due to labor shortages, partially caused by men leaving for California. Had Wilson remained at his trade, he would likely have earned over $2,500 during those 3 years without the hardships, health damage, or separation from family. The gold rush did create tremendous wealth, but primarily for those who never set foot in a mining claim. The merchants who supplied the miners, the transporters who moved them and their goods, the bankers who exchanged and stored their gold, and the land speculators who developed growing California towns accumulated the bulk of the wealth generated by the gold rush. Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco planning to sell canvas for tents to miners. Discovering they needed durable work pants more than tents, he pivoted to clothing production and built a fortune that has lasted generations. Philip Armour, who would later found one of America's largest meatpacking companies, made his initial fortune selling meat to mining camps at massive markups. Collis P. Huntington began as a mining supply merchant before becoming a railroad magnate. These success stories have one common element. They involved profiting from miners rather than from mining. Historical records from Sacramento and San Francisco reveal this wealth transfer mechanism clearly. In 1849 to 1850, the average merchant in these cities earned between $20,000, $30,000 annually, approximately $600,000, $900,000 today. At least 10 times what the average successful miner accumulated in the same period. Banking exchange fees alone skimmed 2 to 5% from every ounce of gold dust miners brought in, creating enormous profits for financial businesses without any of the risks of actual mining. Land speculation represented another major wealth generator that benefited non-miners. John Sutter, on whose land the initial gold discovery occurred, never successfully mined but saw his land holdings become enormously valuable as towns developed around mining regions. Similar stories played out across California as agricultural land was subdivided for settlement. The irony is painful. Many miners who failed to find gold in the ground might have achieved the wealth they sought had they simply purchased California land instead of mining claims. For indigenous Californians and Mexican Californios, the gold rush represented not opportunity, but catastrophe. The influx of American miners and the growth of American settlements displaced these populations from their lands and livelihoods. The native population of California declined from approximately 150,000 in 1848 to 30,000 by 1870. One of the most rapid demographic collapses in American history. This wasn't incidental to the gold rush, but directly caused by disease, starvation, and violence associated with the mining boom. Environmental impacts created another form of lasting damage. Hydraulic mining, which became dominant after the initial rush, washed entire hillsides into river systems, causing devastating downstream flooding and destruction of agricultural land. Mercury used in gold processing contaminated watersheds with toxins that remain present today. The rapid deforestation around mining camps created erosion and habitat destruction that permanently altered California's ecology. These environmental costs were externalized, borne by society, rather than by those who profited from mining. By the mid-1850s, the individual miner's dream had largely given way to industrialized mining operations. Hydraulic mining used high-pressure water cannons to literally wash away hillsides, while hard rock mining required deep shafts and expensive equipment. Both approaches needed significant capital investment beyond the means of individual prospectors. The romantic figure of the independent miner with pan and pickaxe became increasingly anachronistic, replaced by wage laborers working for mining companies. This transition created bitter disappointment for those who had come seeking independence and opportunity. One miner wrote home, "In 1855, I came to California to escape working for wages at another man's direction. After 3 years of finding too little gold to sustain myself, I now work 10 hours daily in the employ of the Excelsior Mining Company, performing harder labor for similar wages to what I earned in Pennsylvania." The dream of independence has become the reality of industrial servitude in a more hostile environment. Some miners adapted to changing conditions by transitioning to other occupations within the growing California economy. Many became farmers, ranchers, or tradespeople in the communities that developed around mining regions. Others found work in the emerging transportation networks, connecting California with the rest of the nation. These adaptive individuals sometimes achieved the prosperity that had eluded them in mining, building successful lives in the state their gold fever had brought them to. For many, however, the gold rush ended with a long, defeated journey home. Historical records suggest that approximately 20% of those who traveled to California for gold died there from disease, accidents, or violence. Of the survivors, an estimated 50 to 60% eventually returned to their places of origin, often with less wealth than they had started with. The remaining 20 to 30% stayed in California, but typically abandoned mining for other occupations. Only a tiny fraction, perhaps 2 to 3% of the original gold seekers, achieved the wealthy return they had dreamed of. The psychological impact of these disappointing outcomes created what some historians have called the gold rush hangover, a collective disillusionment that influenced American attitudes toward get-rich-quick schemes for generations. Newspaper accounts from the 1850s-1860s frequently referenced the California experience as a cautionary tale when reporting on other resource rushes. One editorial from 1858 warned those considering the Colorado goldfields, "Remember California, where thousands found not fortune but disappointment, disease, and early graves. The glitter of distant gold blinds men to certain hardship and probable failure." Yet, despite this well-documented history of disappointment, the California gold rush maintains a powerful positive presence in American cultural memory. It represents a quintessentially American story of risk-taking, opportunity, and possibility. Even though the statistical reality suggests it should be remembered more as a cautionary tale than an inspiration. This gap between historical reality and cultural memory reveals our enduring capacity for optimism in the face of contrary evidence, trait that drove miners to California in the first place. As you reflect on this journey through the harsh realities of gold rush life, the journey, the camps, the tools, the environment, the work, the company, the scams, the food, the medicine, the costs, the law, the vices, the loneliness, and finally, the disappointing odds of success, a question emerges. Why have we romanticized this chapter of history that caused so much suffering for so little reward? Perhaps because the dream itself, however unrealized, speaks to something deep in human nature, the hope that with one lucky strike, one bold venture, one fearless journey, we might transform our lives entirely. Most miners never found that transformation in the goldfields. The few who did paid prices higher than they anticipated, but the dream that drove them continues to resonate, reminding us that human hope is perhaps more resilient than reason, for better or worse. Now, as our journey through this difficult history comes to an end, I hope you've gained a new perspective on this iconic American period. The next time you see those sepia photographs of proud miners holding gold pans, perhaps you'll look more closely at their weathered faces and wonder about the untold hardships behind their determined expressions. Sleep well, knowing you experienced the California gold rush from the comfort of your bed rather than a leaky tent in a disease-ridden mining camp. Sometimes historical tourism is the best kind. You get to visit the past without having to drink the water. As the gold seeker's tale winds down, you feel the weight of their struggles lifting from your shoulders. The voices of desperate miners grow distant, replaced by the comfortable silence of your room. Their dreams of golden glory fade into history as your own thoughts grow quieter. The flickering campfires of the Sierra foothills dim in your imagination. The clanking of mining tools and raucous saloon pianos soften to a whisper. You're drifting now, leaving behind the hardship and heartbreak of those who gambled everything on a glimmer in a stream. Your breathing slows as you release the tension of a journey you never had to make. Tomorrow, you'll wake in comfort those miners never knew. Tonight, you can simply rest, grateful for the wisdom their suffering offers, that sometimes the real treasure isn't found in distant mountains, but in the life you already have. Good night. Sleep well.